The idea of these events is that we take the exhibition as a springboard for wider reflection on the themes and issues that it raises. And I think risk is a particularly rich and open topic, and as you'll see from the programme, we've got people coming at that idea from many different disciplinary perspectives. So the hope is that these approaches will communicate with one another and spark ideas. So I would reinforce what Sarah says, that we very much want your involvement. The structure of the day is that the speakers have been given half-hour slots, and sometimes they may fill those slots, but equally they've been encouraged to allow a little bit of time at the end for question and answers within their individual slot. And then we've got the 2 half-hour panels for wider discussion between speakers and yourselves. So I think without further ado, let's start. And the first speaker is Francesca Cavallo, who's with whom I've collaborated in developing this event, and who of course has also been associate curator for the exhibition. So she's going to give us a little bit of insight into the thinking behind the exhibition before we then go into this morning's group of papers. So Francesca, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks for coming. It is an honor for me to be talking to all of you and to be discussing art and risk today with the symposium. I just would like to say a few words about how contentious and complex is a subject like risk to explore in an exhibition. This is partially because I think everyone owns the idea of risk in a different way. We all have a different threshold of what we feel is risky or not risky for us, or as well what it means to be at risk or not at risk. On the other hand, a lot of different research has been done on risk from the perspective of sociology or of communication, of psychology, risk management, financial risk, health and safety, security, industry, healthcare. Risk is embedded in all these disciplines, and all those disciplines approach the subject from a different perspective. So this amplifies the kaleidoscopic view that we can have of a subject like risk. This makes it particularly challenging for an exhibition, but also very stimulating, and also very stimulating, I think, for a symposium, where we will have different intervention from different angles, because we have art historians, we have artists, we have sociologists, we have cultural historians. So we hope this different perspective, in a way, could create an interesting dialogue. Just because we try to put together all these different angles around risk. Just a few words about risk, the more extreme contraposition of risk. One is the idea that risk is very much associated with trying to predict what is the unpredictable in a way. So there is a sort of conundrum problem in that. For example, I will quote Gerda Reith, as a German sociologist, who says there is not such a thing as risk in life, only dangers we construct in our head. So risk is more like a state of mind. It's very different from danger. If danger are occurrences that they can potentially happen to us and harm us, risk is our attempt to come to terms with them. And so we could say that we can try to manage risk, we can try to embrace risk, we can try to take advantage of risk, we can try to predict potential dangers. So this approach, if we think about the history of humanities, is very much related with modernity and with the idea of progress, because it's different from accepting things that happen to us, from accepting calamities passively, but is oppositely trying to sort of reaffirm our will and our capacities to make decisions in an uncertain world. We all have to come to terms with the fact that we are exposed to dangers and to uncertainties, and we have to make decisions, try to minimize the effects that these dangers imply in our lives. But on the other hand, risk is also the opposite of predictability. Risk also means to dare. And well, I will not go into details in the history of risk and the semantic history of the term, but risicare, which was a word that in Italy in the 12th century was in use, especially maritime context, meant to dare. So we could talk about the positive aspects of risk-taking in society, in science, in art, and the exhibition is a little bit an opportunity to look at how artists take advantage of the possibilities created by taking risk. On the other hand, we could look at other perspectives, for example, the scientific perspective, and there is a recent book that has been published by Elga Notny. I'm not sure I can pronounce the name properly. She's a sociologist of science, and she titled her book "The Cunning of Uncertainty." I really like the idea of the cunning, because what she says is basically that we should try to navigate uncertainties as scientists do, through a process of trial and error, and through the ability to recognize when something significant comes to us. And this is allow us to make decision. But on the same line of inquiry, we can also quote the famous book of Nicolas Nassim Taleb about the black swan, and that is extremely critic of all the attempt to predict and manage the future. And it says that also the best outcomes, they come from what is completely unexpected. And also the biggest transformation in art, in history, they come from what is unexpected. And he invites us to see of how we can navigate through these uncertainties. Finally, Anthony Giddens, the famous sociologist, also political advisor, used to say that risk is the basis of every dynamic society. So something we could discuss a lot about. So there are obviously a lot of implications in what if risk is related to decision making, there are a lot of implications of how it is used in society. Going a little bit more into the exhibition now, there are an incredible multiplicity of themes in this project, a lot of thought and discussions between the different curators working at the projects, Fiona, Sarah, Victoria, the director of Turner Contemporary, myself, a lot of different perspectives. But I will just mention three main ideas. The first one is how artists take advantage of uncertainties and chance in their creative process. And this is the first part of the exhibition that looks at the work, for example, of Marcel Deschamps, and the seminal work, Three Standard Stoppages. It looks also at works of Robert Morris and how he used to talk about lack of control in his work. These ideas are basically related. Margaret Iversen is here. She's an expert on risk and on chance, so it would be great to hear from her her thinking also in relation in the relation between chance and risk. But what I would like to say is that these artists take advantage of chance that can be potentially something, can be potentially losing completely the control of their work, letting go, as we have said, but in the same time using that possibilities along the line of the idea of positive risk-taking. The second line of inquiry is the one that talks about how artists, they submitted themselves to dangerous situations or to situations that they could not totally control, and how they somehow taken advantage of it, and how these situations, especially in performance art, have challenged the artists but also the public in their ability to endure or to view certain circumstances. So we are talking obviously about the work of Marina Abramovic, of Chris Burden, Yoko Ono, Cat Peace, all work that you will see in the exhibition, and also the work of Orlan, for example. Another possible line of research has been exploring how artists, they have somehow addressed and reflect on what it means to live in a risk society, in a society where risk and risk, potential risk, real dangers, potential dangers, they are always thrown at us in a way by communication, by political agendas, etc. This is a moment in time in which we all experience that, because we all somehow under threat of terrorism. So it is for me interesting to see how artists, they somehow reflected on this challenging condition in a way that it can be active in terms of taking serious risk, going against the system, be activist, or in a way that also it reflects on how in a personal life, for example, in the work of Heather Phillipson, how if someone tries to live a normal life, risks are anyway always present around us. And so the question is now, what can art say about risk, and what risk can say about art? I will conclude with that, and I hope you will ask a lot of questions. Again, I hope you will see the exhibition and question the exhibition, criticize the exhibition, and come back with questions for us about these issues. Thank you.
I'm not going to address art here in particular, but I'm trying to give you maybe a background to many of the discussions we're going to have today, and also a background to this whole problem of talking about risk and conceiving of risk by looking historically a little bit. I need to speak up. Okay, I'm trying to. Is this?
You can use the lapel mic if you want to use that one.
Trying to look at his. Sorry for this. Is it better now? Okay. Trying to look historically how our conceptions and our materializations of risks have developed over the last 60 years or so. But let me start by returning to a number of things that Francesca's already alluded to, and what is very important to understand what I'm about to tell you. So risk, from the point of view that I'm going to talk about, is not something which is out there. It's not something that we can take. It's something that we produce. And the important question is, why do we produce it, and when do we produce it, and for what reasons are we producing it? That implies that we don't distinguish between risk and security, because there's no such thing as security. It's just, in that sense, more or less risk, but between risk and danger, where risk is a perspective of the world and the building of the world, which aims to turn future events about which we don't know whether they will happen into something that we can influence with various kinds of things, and you'll immediately see what these things are. Whereas danger is something we can't influence, right? And you'll see that in much more detail, but to give you a very simple example, AIDS, for a very long time, before we knew certain things about it, was only existed as danger, because we couldn't influence it. There was nothing we could change about our behavior not to get it, right? So obviously first we didn't even know what AIDS was, and then we couldn't do anything, but then for a long time we didn't know how it was transmitted, so we couldn't conceive of it as risk. And even after we could conceive of it as risk, there are still a lot of people who would continue to think about AIDS as something that was, coming on us by a force of God, or, there was a sin, which is not thinking about AIDS as risk. So it's not just that there is a risk of AIDS, it depends on how we conceive of AIDS to be a risk or not. Now, there are different ways how we can produce risks. The traditional way, and what is most talked about in the literature, is that we conceive of risk as a risk assessment, as something that we calculate. This is a special kind of sort of expert practice where we try to figure out what the likelihood is of a certain future event to happen or not, and how can we lower that likelihood. But I would like to show you that there are many other ways. In particular, what is interesting, there are forms of materializing risks without necessarily calculating it into things that we build in the world. And also we can simply illocute it, we can simply name it. We can just give it a name, and by that we produce it. We can just say, oh, there's a risk of tripping, and by that I produce the risk of tripping, because obviously I can always trip, but then I just don't conceive of it as a risk. Only by saying, take care, there's a risk of tripping, I produce that risk. Now, what I would like to show you is that the ways how we produce risks can have repercussions in the future for other risks, how we produce them. And that's the main thing I would like to look at by comparing a little bit the production of risk in the UK with Switzerland. And the dryness will stop in a minute. So if you think where is this going to lead to, it will get a little bit more, depressing, but less dry. You'll see. So in both of these countries, what we can see over what was happening since sort of the 1950s to today is that we have a development from a singular risk, where society, and in particular the state and various state agencies on what I will focus, were obsessed with one risk, the risk of nuclear war. And only during the 1980s did this singular risk make way to plural risks, what is now known as an all hazards approach. So that's already an important observation. Most of the Western world was shifting during the 80s, 90s from focusing on a singular risk to plural risks. But there are two very different ways how this happened, and this is why it's interesting to look at these two countries. In the UK, there was mostly an illocution, a naming of this risk without materializing it within the society by state means, which made it very easy, or comparatively easy, for the UK to switch later to all hazards. Whereas in Switzerland, materializing of risk happened on a massive, massive scale throughout society, which then made it very difficult for the state, but also the rest of Switzerland, to switch and to adopt this new risk. And this is what I'm going to tell you briefly about in the next couple of minutes. So to understand that, the basic thing is you look at this statistic from the early 1980s, and you can see the per capita spending on civil defense in various countries. And you can see that in most Western countries, per capita spending was somewhere in the low dollars per head, so $2 to $4 per head, whereas in Switzerland, it was around $30 per head. So Switzerland spent about 10 times more per head on civil defense than Britain. And we cannot explain this by a higher risk of nuclear bombing. Actually, if anything, that risk was lower in Switzerland because Switzerland was a neutral country, whereas the UK, as we all know, was a very important part of the Cold War. So what happened here is that the risk assessment of nuclear war happening was completely different in Switzerland under a similar threat to that of the UK. Sorry. So let's start with what happened in Switzerland. This is how a bunker in Switzerland looks today. And these bunkers, sorry, my is always, these bunkers were built from the early 1950s onwards with a parliamentary decision to build basically a bunker space for each inhabitant. And that led to a law which forced house owners to, when you built a new house, you had to build a bunker under your house. By the 1970s, there were a couple of hundred state bunkers and 300,000 private-built bunkers in Switzerland for a population of approximately 6 million people at that time. Today, and that was from the 1970s onwards, there was a 100% bunker space per head ratio in Switzerland. And obviously this all goes back to a long tradition in Switzerland of engineering in mountains, and the idea that Switzerland is under threat and that the only thing we can do against this threat is retreat into the mountains and into the underground. What is important to understand about this is that at no point in time was a calculation made about the usefulness of these bunkers with regard to other risks, right? But there was obviously a huge exercise in calculating the effectiveness of bunkers. But the calculation of the effectiveness of bunkers was purely one with regard to different forms of ensuring against nuclear disasters. So you can see here that there was a report commissioned in the 1960s where it turned out that the way that the bunker standards came out in Switzerland would have an efficiency rating of approximately 19% to ensure against the impact of a nuclear bomb. But no one ever calculated whether it makes sense to build, say, to spend this money for bunkers or against something else, such as, avalanches, floods, terrorist attacks, or whatever have you. It was from the beginning clear we have to do something against nuclear attack. It was just how do we spend that money best. In the UK, we had a very, very different situation where, again, the state focused purely on nuclear attacks, but the main reason to do something about it was in the form of deterrence, right? So build nuclear weapons for the state to fight aggressors rather than produce something for the population. In fact, in 1968, civil defense was abolished in the UK, and there was virtually no money spent at all to protect the population during that time. At the same time, and I think Peter Kennard can probably tell us much more about this, there were these infamous leaflets called Protect and Survive, which were widely distributed and which attempted to give the population the means to protect themselves against nuclear attacks, telling them they should, for example, put sandbags or books in windows, and that would help against nuclear attacks. Ironically, in the 1950s, the state experts in the UK did experiments, for example, here with sandbags, and the state knew already since the 1950s that this was useless. One problem was that, for example, the stock of sandbags in the UK was by the order of magnitude of 100 too small to actually protect buildings. Also, they found out that if you wanted to put books in your windows, you would need 70 centimeters of books per window. And although the UK is has a rather intellectual population, I think few people would have enough books to put 70 centimeters behind each window. So one knew that all these ideas were rather useless, while at the same time the government built proper bunkers, built according to very similar standards than the one we know from Switzerland, for the government itself, for regional seats of governments, which was uncovered in various steps from the 1970s onwards, which became a huge scandal. So it turned out that the standards for protecting the government were completely different than those for protecting the population, which is obviously a very, very different idea of how to materialize the nuclear risks from Switzerland, where we have this kind of universal protection, where basically every person, every inhabitant is treated the same. Now, how do we get from this to all hazards? To start with the UK and to make this very briefly, what began to happen was that academics started to produce lists of disasters that were happening in an attempt to, in a radical switch from thinking about the singular disaster that actually never happened, nuclear war, to past, and this is very important, to past disasters which we know about. And again, it's important, these were not what we now know as formal risk calculations. It wasn't about the likelihoods of these events to happen. It started by literally just listing past events. This is from a book called Hazard Management and Emergency Planning Perspectives on Britain from 1986. 1992. And you can see that first of all, some of the disasters that happen here are disasters that do not happen in Britain, but that affect Britain, like here, Chernobyl, the nuclear radiation accident. So suddenly this opens up a whole new world of what risks could potentially matter. These disasters are categorized, so they suddenly become members of bigger categories, which are categorized according to sort of its origin of what is happening, rather than, for example, to how severe these disasters were. And the most important thing is that starting with this list is obviously very selective. It just opens up the question, what could be included and what was left out, what else could be included, which can be seen from when they describe this list. They end their description by saying, oh, and we could also include other things, such, for example, the side effects of an arthritic drug called Oprane, which obviously at that time were in the news and was seen as some problematic thing. So suddenly it's like, oh, and what about side effects of drugs? What about this? What about that? And we have this explosion of risks and we don't know how to tame it. Because suddenly, once we stop losing this sort of nuclear thing as one singular risk in our head, we don't know where to stop anymore. And there is no stop rule. There's no simple rule that would tell us what to include and what not, right? Which, to make a very complex story extremely short, led eventually to something which is now called the risk register, which was something that was not public until, I think, 2010. But now we have state experts which sit together and produce these registers, which basically put all risks in one single plane. They become, on a visual level, indistinguishable from each other, and they follow this sort of classical risk calculation logic of relative impact and relative likelihood. And we don't need to distinguish anymore about their sources, we don't need to distinguish about their effects, We don't need to distinguish about how we counter them and so on and so forth. Obviously, this is still happening sort of behind and in the operations of various state agencies, but as a form of conceiving risks, this is what we're left with. And you think, oh, well, that's obvious, but now look what happened in Switzerland. So I'm just going to briefly look at two important reports that were produced in the 1990s. This is from 1990, and what you can see here is that risks. How much time do I have left? Okay. Okay, I'm done in 3 minutes. That's no problem. So what you can see here is that we have two categories. One are power-political dangers, and the other are the remaining existential dangers. And this isn't a coincidence, but this goes back to a very, very strong resistance of the Swiss security apparatus to break down this barrier, because the whole system of civil defense and having these bunkers in place and having this, something I didn't talk about, having the Swiss population enrolled in doing all kinds of exercises with these bunkers depends on this. It depends on having this as the main risk, right? And in the late 1990s, 1999, there was another report commissioned which was based on a very complex risk analysis, which basically ended up in producing this blob, as you can see here, where all kinds of risks in a similar way to the UK end up in this blob, including terrorism, blackmail, information war, disasters, organizational crime, military force, and so on and so forth. So everything is one single blob. But this report, and in particular the underlying scientific expertise which was doing these calculations, was commissioned but then not made public and actually made to disappear, again because of that problematic singularity and plane in which the risks existed. But funnily, and again to make something very complex very short, in 2011, finally, this kind of problem with how to produce risks was sort of accepted, and there was a vote in Parliament in which the law which would force house owners to build bunkers under their houses was abolished. So until 2011, this law existed, and only after a lot of struggles about this policy and the landscape of risk, this was abolished. This was in, I think, April 2011. 6 weeks later, Fukushima happened. And the parliament decided to go back to their vote and voted again on the same law and reinstated that law. So the law was out of force for about 8 weeks or something, and now it's in force again. And this is a newspaper article which is talking about this, because suddenly the bunkers that were built, that existed under every Swiss house, suddenly found their new purpose, ensuring us, or ensuring Swiss citizens against nuclear disasters. And I think I end here.
Yes, I guess I fall into the first category of the exhibition, with the positive use of risk in the field of art. In the emergence of cinematic time, which is a wonderful book by Marianne Doan, she explains how around 1900 time became palpable. Modern metropolitan life, it became clear, was only possible given the imposition of standard time, Railways, in particular, demanded synchronization, as you can imagine, with schedules and clocks everywhere, and soon everyone was obliged to wear a watch, which he calls a kind of prosthetic device extending the capacity of the body to measure time. The rationalization of time entered the workplace with machines for clocking in, and invaded the body of the worker with Taylorist adaptations of chronophotography, as scientists armed with stopwatches and cameras measured the time and motion of workers for maximum efficiency. In short, time became lived differently owing to these new technologies, including technologies of representation. Jonathan Crary extended this argument in his recent book, 24/7, Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep, observing how technologies of the Industrial Revolution have now been supplanted by those of the Information Age, which create a homogeneous time of sleeplessness. Photography and film undoubtedly contributed to the rationalization and regulation of time, yet they are also potentially resistant to it, and this is what Doan argues, suggesting that their indexical nature enables them to, quote, make possible what had previously been beyond the grasp of representation, the inscription of contingency. As an indexical medium, photography operates outside of human control. It registers without consciousness of registration, and so enables special access to contingency. As a consequence, Doan claims, it is able to rupture the fabric of existence. Modernity is associated, of course, with the progress of rationalization, but also with epistemologies and aesthetic theories that valorize the ephemeral or chance occurrence. No doubt the pressure exerted by the rationalization process provokes or induces a kind of utopian desire to capture it. The word contingency means freedom from necessity. The contingent is a chance occurrence or accident or a state of things dependent on an uncertain event. Yet, as Doan points out, the Latin root word tangere means to touch, to come into contact. So, rather interestingly, chance and indexicality are linked in the concept of contingency. For Doan, it is photography's photochemical or photoelectronic properties that make it an indexical medium, and so capable of rupturing the fabric of existence. Yet C.S. Peirce distinguished between two aspects of the index. It signifies, on the one hand, by establishing an existential or causal link to its referent, either by being physically impressed or affected by it, or, on the other hand, by directing our attention to it. So if you take the first case, a fingerprint is an obvious example of the index as trace, while a pointing finger is, and also demonstrative pronouns like this and that, are indices of the second kind. Photography is thus doubly indexical. It's causally affected by light, and it also frames something and points to something. Now, it seems to me that painting can incorporate the camera's indexical property of pointing and framing. And I want to demonstrate that this is the case by drawing your attention to this amazing painting by Hopper, where you see, I guess, what you would have seen if you had been stopped at a red light on Columbus Circle, New York City, circa 1936. Now, as you can see from vintage photographs, Columbus Circle is actually rather a busy and cluttered roundabout. So one wonders why he wanted to paint it in this way and not, showing the dynamism of the city or our exhilarated response to it. Rather, he's interested in the effects of using a car as an apparatus or a part of a larger apparatus that frames a contingent field of vision. The windscreen through which you are imagined looking is a large lens that focuses and frames apparently without the intervention or intention of the artist. In other words, circle theater, far from being a subjective view, is rather one that implies the absence of the self. I want to claim that this is an example of a depiction of things grouped around an empty center. It suppresses composition in favor of depiction of a world wide open to contingency. Like photography and film, which are both implicated in rationalization and resistant to it, the train and the car can act as vehicles both implicated in the whole infrastructure of rationalization, but also capable of capturing contingency. Now, there have been some interesting inquiries into what has sometimes been called the vehicular conditions of perception. One is by a woman called Sarah Danius, The Senses of Modernism, Technology, Perception, and Aesthetics, which talks about the way in which new technologies were taken up in contemporary literature. She writes, for example, about how the car enabled a kind of visual experience that altered habitual modes of seeing. It is, she says, a cinematic framing device on wheels. She notes that in Proust, the railway compartment moves through the landscape like a projector apparatus. The viewer in the train sees a quick succession of images, which the theorist Wolfgang Schivelbusch refers to as panoramic perception. He wrote this classic book called The Railway Journey, The Industrialization of Space and Time in the 19th Century. And it says of panoramic perception, in contrast to traditional perception, it no longer belonged to the same space as the perceived. The traveler saw the objects, landscapes, etc., through the apparatus, which moved him through the world. That machine and the motion it created became integrated into his visual perception. So Proust wrote about vision in motion and its effects upon the subject, quite differently from the usual kind of shock effects, and the tendency to absorb and parry shocks, which you get in Walter Benjamin's text, for example. Artists have used the window or the train of a train or a car as automatic framing devices, and this is what I particularly want to stress. Notions of panoramic perception only take us so far, but I think that we can gain a deeper understanding of this phenomenon by just looking more closely at circle theater and the other paintings sort of that inform it. I will argue that the vehicle acts in the same way as an optical instrument, presenting sense data independent of an observer. Bertrand Russell referred to such mind-independent sense data as sensibilia. We might use the word virtual in this context. For instance, the image on the ground glass of a double reflex camera isn't a mental event, but neither is it an object. And Virginia Woolf, who I'll speak about later, no doubt familiar with Russell's views, had the character Bernard in her book, The Waves, wonder, but how to describe a world without a self. Now, this argument that I'm putting forward is actually very much indebted to the literary theory of Anne Banfield. She studied such writers as Flaubert, Proust, and Virginia Woolf to develop an idea of a certain kind of mode of narration which uses deictics, that is, indexical words like this and here and now. And these normally mark out a present space, but in lots of literature, they are combined with the past or imperfect tense. So in Virginia Woolf, she says, now he was crossing the bridge over the Serpentine. So you have now, deictically, in the present, and a past tense, was. It's a sentence you could only have in literature. It doesn't make sense in any other context. This is called le style indirect libre in French. And she says of it, it's a perspective unoccupied by any subject, a kind of camera consciousness. So, she kind of elaborates on Roland Barthes' theory of photography, that it too describes a world without a self, which has, certain implications for the subject. In her essay, The Cinema, Virginia Woolf made a similar point, noting that the appearances in film that we behold, she says, we behold them as they are when we are not there. We see life as it is when we have no part in it. Now let's get back to Hopper. Housetops is an etching Hopper made in 1921, which shows a woman twisting her whole torso around so she can observe the world going by, while a man down the other end of the carriage is completely locked up in a box, untouched by the space that he's traversing. In most of his pictures, however, Hopper dispenses with that mediating figure of the woman turning around and just shows you the view out of the train or the elevated train, the overground in New York. Both the woman and the implied viewer are positioned as train passengers, and as such, the agency of both is diminished while the urban scene scrolls past. Many of the paintings could be described as stills from cinematic tracking shots, and of course, when you're talking about trains, it's more than a metaphor. We know that Hopper loved to ride on trains and sketch what he saw, watching the world go by. I want to give a bit more substance to exactly why he was interested in this. It was for him, I want to say, a new vehicle of perception. And he went so far as to actually depict interiors as if viewed from a moving vehicle. We know this from what he said about this picture, Office at Night. The painting was probably first suggested by many, this is what he wrote, the picture was probably first suggested by many rides on the L, that's the elevated train, in New York City, after dark, and glimpses of offices' interiors that were so fleeting as to leave a fresh and vivid impression on my mind. I mean, you might think that there's a bit of a contradiction between the fleeting impression and the vivid impression at the same time, but there's clearly something that caught his attention while the world scrolled past. So this is an example of the elevated train. It's just a cheaper alternative to a subway. So it traversed a space that used to be private, and so you could see into the rooms on either side of a street. And early versions of this, as you can see, the point of view is much lower, and you can kind of see that there's a window frame depicted. And he kind of gets rid of that, and perhaps makes of the window on the right something of a surrogate point of view with his artificial light kind of projected inside. But it's only, in the final version where the point of view is so high and has that special sense of being kind of accidentally viewed from a moving vehicle. This one, he said, actually was taking walks at night, that he would sort of see something in a lighted window that struck him. And you can also see from his views from cars, other than Circle Theatre, my main example, that this is a sort of picture of a country road at dusk where a car is approaching the gas station. And a lot of his paintings are taken up with the road. Really, half of this picture is just road where he would pull over and sketch. So you can see that Circle Theatre is kind of a subgenre of the view from the moving vehicle from a car in an urban setting. The implied car has come to a halt, so to speak, at a red light, making the view random and accidental. There's so many layers of superimposition. The road, and then you can hardly see it, can you? This is a closed newspaper stand, and then there's this amazing entrance to the underground, which completely, or nearly completely, blocks the marquee of Circle Theatre, which was ostensibly, what he's depicting here. I would suggest that it's kind of a very strange point of view to pick, unless, what you want is a contingent view of a world, if that's what you're aiming at. Before leaving Hopper, I want to just indicate one more painting. This is one of the last. It's called Sun in an Empty Room, where this fabulous lightfall, broken by the architecture, acts as a kind of sundial. It will move across and up the wall as time passes, and reminds me of a section from Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. The middle section is during the First World War, when a house by the seaside is abandoned. So it's an empty house, and she describes the interiors of the house, which gradually deteriorates. Gusts of wind nose their way upstairs. The lighthouse beam brushes with its pale footfall upon the stair and mat. And she closes this section. So loveliness reigned and stillness, and together made the shape of loveliness itself, a form from which life had departed. Solitary, like a pool at evening, far distant, seen from a train window, vanishing so quickly that the pool, pale in the evening, is scarcely robbed of its solitude, though only seen once. It's remarkable, I think, that even though she's been describing an interior, she closes with this metaphor of this pool of light seen from a train window. So the fugitive, irretrievable sight of the pond of light seen from a train window. Hopper's Sun in an Empty Room share with photography this evocation of death and the uncanny. I want to change mood a bit with just a few examples of stills from Chantal Akerman's films, who sadly recently committed suicide. She was a Belgian-born artist and filmmaker who, visited New York in the early 70s, very, kind of influential for her work, came in contact with avant-garde filmmakers like Michael Snow. Yet critics very often mention Hopper in thinking about him. This is a still from Hotel Monterey. But it's not really these hotel rooms and solitary people in them that makes me interested in her. This is also from that film where she's finally on the roof taking filming rooftops in a 360-degree pan. But I'm rather more interested in a film from 1977 called News from Home, because the emphasis in that is kind of picture of New York, portrait of New York, much of which is taken from moving vehicles. In this case I'm showing right here, it's she places the camera. You can just about see her reflection. Well, you could if the image were better. Inside the subway car, and then it moves along and then opens up, and you see, this composition of, pillars, signs, posters, people on the platform, and so on. The door is closed, and the train goes on, and so on. So every time the door opens, presumably she's wondering, what will happen, but she has no control over that process. So she kind of uses the sliding doors of the subway as a large, kind of camera lens in a way. Although in fact it is one long take. And Marianne Doan says of the single long take, she says, it epitomizes the openness of film to contingency and chance. The longer the shot is held, the more likely the invasion of the unplanned, of the contingent event. So the work of Hopper and Ackerman, we see examples of work where the vehicle and camera are integrated into representations which bring out the accidental character of the scene. We glimpse a world beyond the control of consciousness, an involuntary perception, which is capable of disrupting those habits and conventions which shield us from an apprehension of the real. I want to close just with mentioning another bit from Virginia Woolf, which I was kind of using here as theory, literature as theory. And that's an essay called Street Haunting, a London Adventure, where she writes about the joys of walking along a lamplit street in London on a winter evening. She writes that home is full of reminders of oneself, familial attachments. But she writes, when the door shuts on us, all that vanishes. The shell-like covering which our souls have excreted to house themselves, to make for themselves a shape distinct from others, is broken. And there is left, of all those wrinkles and roughness, a central oyster of perceptiveness, an enormous eye. So she sheds her protective domestic shell, her exoskeleton, exteriorized ego, and goes walking at night. The Amform oyster eye, you might seem, is a bit removed from the view from the train or the car window, but what unites them really is this stress on depersonalization, this shedding of, the accretion of habit and so on. The stipulation that the walk must be, dusk in the winter when windows are brightly illuminated is another thing that's important, because like the view from a vehicle, these conditions encourage a kind of receptivity and reverie. So the effect on vision of the view from the moving vehicle overlaps with that of viewing illuminated windows at night, and these share, of course, certain qualities with the conditions of viewing film. They all contrive to reveal a purely contingent look of things in a world without a self. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So look, to be an artist, to be creative, is to aim to do something, we'll say, new, surprising and valuable. And of course, in trying to do that, that often involves a high degree of uncertainty. So here's something I take to be rather beautiful by Ian Davenport in the Jerwood Art Gallery down in Hastings. So he tends to make his painting by pouring pigment on the canvas and using syringes. He, as it were, structures it in a certain way, so it's likely to turn out a certain kind of a way, but he doesn't know. So he said, actually, of this series, he said, that's the great thing about practicing and doing art and being an artist. You're never too sure where you're going to end up, and it really is a personal journey. And of course, like all personal journeys, the artist needs to try things out, you need to experiment, you need to learn from your failures, and you need to take risks. And certain kinds of creativity maybe involve much higher degrees of uncertainty. So, for example, what you might think of as exploratory creativity is going to involve a much higher degree of uncertainty. So, if you're, for example, doing a certain kind of work which is an elaboration and a slightly different variation on something you've done before, then you're not going to be that uncertain about what you're doing. You're going to have in your head maybe a very clear idea of what you're doing. But if you're trying a new style out, or you're trying a new form out, or you're, as it were, maybe part of the process, you don't know where you're going to go, that's going to involve a much higher degree of uncertainty than merely elaborative creativity. But just to be uncertain and just to try things out isn't actually necessarily to take risk, okay? Because for something to be a risk, something's got to matter, all right? Here's a sort of very prosaic example, not particularly artistic one. You might experiment in the kitchen with a recipe, and unless you're experimenting and new guests are coming to dinner, it's not much of a risk, right? If it fails, well, it doesn't matter, you try again, it's no big deal. Maybe if you're trying it out for the first time and you've got people coming to dinner, that's a bit risky, all right? Because maybe it won't work and now you've not got dinner, right? That's not good. So something's got to be at stake. So the question is not whether it involves uncertainty, but when does uncertainty involve risk? Because it doesn't always involve risk. Something's got to be at stake. So when, where, and why are things at stake for artists? Well, here's an artist with an exhibition, with something in the exhibition currently here, Ai Weiwei. Obviously, he takes a certain kind of, amongst other things, high degree of personal risk. All right, so this is from his Wenshan or Sichuan steel rebar series. So I don't know if you know it. It's actually straightened steel bars that they put in concrete buildings from the province of Sichuan, where there was a huge earthquake disaster and lots of schools collapsed and lots of school children died. And it was a huge political scandal in China because these things were supposed to be built up to a certain kind of earthquake spec, but they weren't because actually a lot of corruption was involved. So these buildings, which were supposed to withstand this earthquake, actually collapsed. So we have a kind of visual art piece, which is a kind of, not just a beautiful thing, but once you understand something about it, you realise that it's both a memorial and a political provocation, okay, to a very dictatorial government, and exposes him and puts him at political risk. And of course, funnily enough, no coincidence, it turns out after he started doing this series, oh, lo and behold, gets put in prison for tax and so on and so forth. So there's a way in which you can put yourself at political risk, and actually sometimes under certain circumstances, just in virtue. So this is Emil Nolde. He was put on, despite actually initially having Nazi sympathies, was put under house arrest by the Nazis. He used to come and check that he wasn't doing any art. So he had actually did a very beautiful series of watercolours, because of course he didn't want to stop doing his art. But that was when, as it were, even an ordinary watercolour was a kind of risk, because they come search his house, they had to be very small, so they're all about this small, right? So he could hide them in the right kind of a way. So one way of taking risk is that we're putting yourself at risk with respect to, in this case, social or political authorities. Here's Artemisia Getticelli. Forgive my pronunciation. Thank you very much. There we go. Right, okay. So now I know better. Very Caravaggio-esque. If you know Caravaggio, there's a story about personal abuse and rape, but just by virtue of being a kind of significant female artist, she was the first female artist, I believe, to be admitted to the Italian guilds in the Renaissance, highly supported by her father, but just in virtue of practicing art meant that because she was different and going against all sorts of gender stereotypes and social norms that exposed herself to. So, for example, people would say things like, oh, obviously she's a woman, she can't be that good, her father must have helped her out, right? Or exposed herself to certain kinds of envy, or people talk about the rape as kind of, well, that's the kind of person she is. And so there's a kind of personal risk, not political, but a social risk there in terms of trying to pursue and practice your art. So in order for something to be risky, something must be at stake, you must be exposing yourself to something that matters. And there's ways in which you can do that, personal safety, but it can also be things like maybe your artistic career or your artistic reputation, maybe your health or safety, maybe your well-being, maybe your relationships, maybe your artistic integrity or authenticity might be at stake. So Samuel Palmer, for example, was persuaded by his wife to start doing much more commercial art, which was slightly more successful, in order to help get the house and get the career. And it was only later in his career he turned to his actually very good early works. So there's a kind of move towards commercial and then back out, and there's a kind of sacrifice of artistic integrity there, which is a risk he took. So of course we tend to think, well look, something's got to be at stake, and we have this image of artists as people who have to take risks where something's at stake, your personal reputation is exposing. And so one of the things that's important is that we shouldn't be afraid of failure. And I think there's something right about that, and there's something right about the image of artists as risk takers. If you do, there's some bunch of standard psychological evidence which tends to suggest that people who are not just creative but particularly artists tend to register high up on registers for openness to experience or being risk seekers rather than risk avoiders. So there's kind of image, and there's a sort of trope in our culture is, don't be afraid of failure. You have to take risks in order to learn, right? Not just embrace uncertainty, but you have to take risks and not be worried about ridicule or exposing yourself, because that's, as it were, how in exploratory creativity you're going to end up doing something new, surprising and valuable. And I think that that's true. And I'm going to say a little bit about why I think that's true, but I also think that that's a kind of slightly risky image too, because I think it overlooks something that's important, namely, as it were, one can be a risk seeker in the wrong kind of a way. And actually, I'm going to say a little bit about that at the end. So, of course, fear of failure is pretty normal and standard. It's usually embraced as part of the creative process. One might say to one's art students, or one would say, to oneself, don't, talk oneself out of the anxiety. Don't be worried about trying something new. Don't be worried about just kind of looking forward, because that's how you're going to do something good. Sometimes it's associated with perfectionism. So this is kind of slightly controversial, but some people think that Leonardo da Vinci was a perfectionist, and this is an explanation as to why. So the reason we don't have many Leonardo da Vincis is not unlike with some other artists, because there were loads and then we lost some and lots got burnt and destroyed. No, there were hardly any. He only completed about 30-some works. Right, so we've got most of them. All right, he just never bloody finished them. He'd have things where they were undone for 15 years, and there's sort of documentation about people saying he'd go back, he'd look at it. His day's work would be stepping backwards and forwards in front of the canvas. He'd maybe do one thing. Later in the day, he'd go back and undo it, and that would be it. Right? Some of us have been there at least, but anyway, okay. So one of the things that people often say about Leonardo is that he was a troubled perfectionist. But notice, of course, you don't have to be, let's put it this way, perfectionism need not be undermining. Okay, here's someone who I take it is a self-confessed perfectionist. So this is what Marina Abramovich, who's also in the exhibition, said. This is one of her very famous series, The Artist is Present. This is on the opening night at MoMA. But she said she had a kind of question and answer session on Reddit. And this is what she said on Reddit. She said, "I'm my own worst critic. I'm a perfectionist. Before I start a performance, I have to have everything in place. And I am obsessive about the details. But once I start, I let it go. And whatever unexpected thing happens in that time, and that's a part of a piece." Okay. So here's someone who's a perfectionist, and she is a troubled perfectionist, but it doesn't stop her, as maybe controversially with the case of Leonardo, it doesn't stop her being highly creative in a way which is, as it were, pretty reliable over time. She's done a very significant, substantial body of work over the last 20, 30 years or more. So perfectionism as such needn't, as it were, undermine your creativity. But of course, fear of failure needn't be tied up to perfectionism, as it were. You can be highly anxious and it can undermine your creativity in a way which isn't necessarily to do with perfectionism. It might not be because your goal is so high. It might be because you're so troubled or so anxious or worried about looking a fool or being ridiculed or not taken seriously, even if your standards aren't that high, that, as it were, stops you from developing artistically. So what are the kind of factors that tend to make for that kind of crippling fear of failure? Well, here's a bunch of key factors. One thing is the degree of uncertainty and ambiguity of realizing or achieving the thing you're setting out to do. Another is going to be your degree of lack of self-confidence. Something else is the degree of mattering, so, as it were, the degree to which it's perceived of as high stakes. Okay? So, if you're in a nice kind of friendly environment and you're not going to get taken to town, that's one thing. But if you know that, you're in an environment where it's going to be fiercely highly critical and you're going to feel self-exposed, maybe your work is about you as well, then, as it were, the stakes are psychologically ramped up. And then there might be a degree of, at least if you're anxious, you tend to ruminate about and project negative consequences. You might think of as it were, failure in all or nothing terms, which is a very different thing from thinking, did it quite work? Right? So if you're, as it were, fear of failure is undermining, people tend to think of success or failure in all or nothing terms. Whereas people, even when they're perfectionists who aren't troubled, don't think of it in all or nothing terms. They think of things as quite coming off or not quite working or being first drafts for something that they're going to refine. So there are psychological differences both in terms of the kinds of things people crippled by fear of failure pay attention to, but also the kind of evaluations that they make. It tends to be all or nothing, tends to ruminate fantastical about future negative consequences seen as inevitable. So that, I think, is, as it were, the truth in the idea that artists need to be risk takers and they need to be brave and they need to be courageous and they need to have fortitude. And notice, of course, I'm talking about creative character. I'm talking about the character of the artistic personality required to be a good artist, at least across different kinds of situations. That is not, for example, not everyone's always going to be automatically friendly and sympathetic to what you're trying to do, and you don't want to be only creative when everyone's very nice to you, right? Because that's not going to happen that often. Okay. So I think the role of character is very important, and as it were, we might want to say what a good artistic personality involves is, of course, there's a way in which you should be afraid of failure, right? Something matters, but it shouldn't be crippling. So it should be more like the kind of Abramovich kind of style than, as it were, the task-averse kind of style that I've been talking about. On the other hand, I also want to say that actually people can risk take in the wrong kind of a way, or in a way which isn't as bad as it were, being crippled by fear of failure, but is still less than ideal. And that is, people can be too full of themselves. Okay. So rather than being, as it were, underconfident, they might be far too confident, far too arrogant, we might say. So here's a characterization from Spinoza of a certain kind of pride, and I'm just going to call it arrogance. So Spinoza characterizes arrogant pride as thinking more highly of oneself than is just as a function of love. Let's call it conceit. Okay. So the first feature, that is thinking too highly of yourself, is explained by the second, that is you're conceited. And then the idea is going to be that's going to explain, as it were, how you respond emotionally, but also the kinds of behaviours and the kinds of risks you take. That's the thought. So in Cellini's biography, he really laid down, as it were, the template for the kind of artistic, racy, how amazing am I autobiography. So we've got sort of grand Renaissance artists, silversmith, goldsmith, architect, you name it, he had his hand at it. So in his autobiography, he's always going on about things like, I've never had a man of his profession who has pleased me more or deserved a greater reward, said this king, that prince, about Cellini. He's always going about how his peers are really envious of him because he's so bloody amazing. He's always falling out with them because they recognise that he's so good. And when they're not falling out with him, they're always, as reported in his autobiography, saying things like, "In all my life, Cellini, I've never seen anything more wonderful," or "Benvenuto, he is the pride of our profession, and it is only right that we should take off our hats, both to his work and to him, for he is the peer without peers." It's that kind of, right, okay, so all that kind of self-glorification. And it's a trope which is quite familiar. So John Richardson, who's a very well-known biographer of Picasso, a man not known for his humility, called his fairly recent collection of pieces on different artists he's known throughout his career, Sacred Monsters, Sacred Masters, right? They turn out to be quite full of themselves, a little bit arrogant, a little bit, okay. And the idea here is that arrogance can lead people to be too daring or too audacious or taking the wrong kind of risks in ways which actually turn out to be creatively undermining or which actually explain creative underperformance. So, here is, I think, an example of this. Damien Hirst. So, here's what Tom Lubbock, the recently deceased, not a man known for being shy as an art critic, said of this. "As for what Damien Hirst thinks he's doing here, it is not my business, but anyone may wonder. Yearning to be among the masters and blinded by self-belief, maybe." So notice here we have ambitious desire with high inflated self-belief. It's Spinoza's characterization. And yet I could imagine another famous, truer artist who had made their name in assemblage and who decided to try their hand at painting, but when it turned out like this, realized it simply would not do, and sighed and put it away, their fame and vanity not having warped their judgment. Well, the artist can make a fool of himself and it doesn't matter. I'm sure the pictures will sell for a packet anyway, and if the critics are rude, and I jolly well hope they are, the buyers need only be reminded of Van Gogh, rejected by all in his time, now seen as great. Ignore the slight circularity of this argument as it is endlessly repeated. No, it is our poor little art world that I feel so sorry for. With this, we just look so bloody stupid. Now, I shall distance myself slightly from this. Notice the structure of Tom Lubbock's criticism there. So, here's Damien Hirst. Actually, it was universally panned and actually felt a bit harsh, might be an overreaction to the success he himself found. It's kind of pseudo Francis Bacon, really, isn't it? Anyway, the structure of the psychological explanation there is someone who has found fame, let's say it has gone to his head, inflated self-belief, has led someone to take on an artistic project of what they're not capable of, and then blinded by that self-belief has exhibited it because they think it's great, and yet it turns out to be a complete failure. Right? So in other words, there's a kind of a risk, what we might call an Icarus effect, right, of high inflated self-belief leading to overreaching ambition, which can then explain creative failure. Different kind of, but related creative non- or underperformance is, I think, that of Benjamin Robert Hayden. These are not people afraid of failure, right? What they don't need is take more risks, be braver. No. Take fewer risks, be more careful. Think about how good you really are, right? Don't ramp up your self-confidence, right? Tamp it down, thank you very much. You'll do better, okay? So we had Damien Hirst, and that's, let's call it the Icarus effect. I'm going to call this one the Cyclops effect. Right? Cyclops, the one-eyed titans of Greek legend. And the idea here is that actually inflated self-conceit leads to creative misdirection. Okay? Rather than overreaching ambition and failure, it leads to creative misdirection. So Benjamin Robert Hayden, contemporary of Wordsworth, Keats, all that crowd, by testimony of many and all and sundry, incredibly full of himself, wanted to restore the grand place of history painting. I think it had fallen down, and he was the man to do it. And he'd set up an art school, and he wanted to attract people to him. He wanted to become a member of the Royal Academy. They wouldn't accept him. And he spent all his time, well, nearly all his time, doing works of this kind. And look at it. It's kind of all right, but really, I mean, okay, this is not a horse that's supposed to be falling into some hole which is, you know, that deep. It's supposed to be sort of charging into battle because it's the great Roman general Marcus. Right, so he spent all his time doing this stuff, and yet look at this. Right? This is really good. All right? But he didn't value it, and he didn't value his own production of what he was really good at, which is this kind of slightly more observational, slightly more on the fly, not so grandiose, not full of such grandeur. You know, his life might have been spent doing much more of this rather than ending up a bitter old man feeling neglected because you overrated how good you were at that. Okay. So of course take risks, but make sure you're not taking the right ones, and make sure, well, of course, some of us should be afraid, some of us should work on our self-belief, but there is a kind of trope around, whereas it's all about don't be afraid of failure. No, sometimes you should be afraid of failure. Right? Because you can fail pretty badly. Right? Or you can waste your artistic life. That's a bit harsh on Haydn. He didn't waste it, but really he could have done so much better had it been better directed. Okay, so artistic character matters. On the other hand, there is, as it were, something more going for arrogance than there is for crippling fear of failure. Okay? And one way of thinking about it is this. I mean, you might end up taking risks, but at least you're taking risks. If you're crippled by fear of failure, that's inaction, so you won't take any risks, so you really won't creatively develop. Okay? So, as it were, you're much more likely to end up doing, how shall I put it, quite a lot of creative things if you're arrogant in a way which you won't if you're crippled by fear of failure. But arrogance will expose you to certain possible failures or creative misdirections that you wouldn't be exposed to if you weren't arrogant. Nonetheless, arrogance will get you a long way. So here is Julia Margaret Cameron, who's one of the earliest pioneers of photography. I mean, so she was amazing in terms of her experimentation. So this is actually a period when in photography everyone was trying to capture every detail in as much precise detail as possible. And one of the things that hopefully you'll notice is very striking is how emotionally affective and dramatic this is. And it's partly because it's not just it's the face and the eyes, but look at the blurring of the background. And that was very distinctive and unique at this time in photography when everyone was trying and capture everything. All right? So you get that kind of almost sfumato effect in the background, which gives it both a dreamy quality in the background, but then it really gives the face a greater heightened emotional punch. But, you know, this lady was not shy, right? So this is Julia Margaret Cameron being rather modest about her own work. This is not this piece, but of another portrait. It is one of the finest, no, it is the finest thing ever done in art. She writes of a later series of photographs of which this is produced. The like of this has never been produced and never will be surpassed. And writing in, an art critic wrote of her that she was the first person who had the wit to see her mistakes were successes and to make her portraits systematically out of focus and see this as a virtue. So, of course, she experimented. Notice, of course, actually, if you're in an age where not only are you doing something in a new art, which was getting quite difficult to take seriously, but you're a woman, right? A certain degree of, let's call it chutzpah, might be a good thing. So one way of thinking about this might be something like this. I mean, if one's going to have a failing, better to be arrogant than crippled by failure, especially in a society which, as it were, makes it very difficult for you to. So look, the idea is not that people can't be creative if they're arrogant. Clearly they can, and that can get them quite a long way. It's just that arrogance might expose them to certain kinds of possible risks or creative failures that they would be wiser not to have undertaken. That is, they should aim to be self-assured rather than self-conceited. So here's two artists, very different type, but fairly modern, Steve McQueen and Barbara Hepworth, who I take to be self-assured rather than arrogant. And what do I mean by self-assured? I mean, they're not meek, right? They're pretty high in self-confidence, all right? And they've got competence, but that's, as it were, in a sense, justified. And one of the things that marks someone out as self-assured as opposed from arrogance is that people like Barbara Hepworth question the value about what they do. Of course, they don't allow themselves. So, for example, one of the things Barbara Hepworth did, even when she was defined by the men in her life, sometimes people say, oh, were you a pupil of Henry Moore's? Right? So even when, as it were, she was defined like that by other people, she didn't allow that to affect her work. Right? So she was self-assured. But this is someone who constantly talked to people around her in terms of how they responded to her work, how she could improve, and so on and so forth. So wasn't, as it were, blinded by the kind of self-conceit that Lubbock alleges Damien Hirst was, and most of his friends thought Robert Hayden clearly was. So, of course, as is in the culture, there's an important trope about not being too afraid of failure. But one should be afraid of failure in the right kinds of ways too. Thank you very much.
No, yeah, obviously you're right. And something I completely omitted in this talk, also due to brevity, is that what was very important was obviously the leftist critique of existing civil defense throughout the Western world. And part of that critique was that this complete focus on nuclear attacks really is a form of sort of paranoid living, which we don't want. And this was very important to establish other forms of doing that. I was just showing this list because I think it's important as a form to understand what this move away from this single risk meant, and what this sudden occurrence of multiple risks on one page of paper meant, and what problems bringing all this list, or bringing all these things on one piece of paper brings with it, as for example that you don't know where to stop. But obviously, no, it wasn't the academics by themselves who invented that at all. And actually it is important to see that all hazards were, in a more narrower sense, this whole idea of all hazards was not a British invention but an American invention, which had a lot to do with the fact that the American civil defense knew about various routines and were thinking about how to use or became aware that all these routines were actually similar and could be used for various kinds of disasters. So in the US it had a much more practical route as well. So no, it's far more complex, but this, my point was simply to point out what this listing produces, and that this was an important moment. I would just like to make one comment to bring that together, and also to point out something which I think is at the root of the exhibition, and that is that, what I was talking about, and whenever we look at state civil protection, civil defense, disaster, risk, it's always about the avoidance of risks. Whereas if we look at art, and I think this is very much a compensatory discourse which mimics what we see, what I was talking about, is that risk is seen as something positive. Right? I think this is very important to understand. Well, the whole field I was talking about, obviously it's all about the avoidance of risk. Whatever the risk is, it's about avoiding it. No one would say, we should be taking risks. Right? Everyone would say, are you crazy? we have to do something against it. And a lot of the artworks, and particularly the artworks that actually move into that sort of more explicit direction of risk-taking, are in a way a compensatory exercise to take up these pressures of trying to minimize risks. And it's new.
Yes. I just thought there was a point of contact, because I thought that your comparison of UK and Switzerland, that they were like national characters, a bit like the artistic personalities that you were devising, and that there was a certain, implication that Switzerland's personality actually was quite destructive in the end, or wasteful, or, that to have that monomaniacal defensive posture, perhaps not such a hard idea. Is that?
Yes.
That's someone else?
Yes,
Hello, I'm Ellie Carpenter, so I'll be in conversation with Peter Kennard later on this afternoon. So my question perhaps is a link to that, and we can pick up on it again later. But it's to do with temporality of risk, so the understanding of risk as an event, a risk event, and perhaps risk-taking or risk exposure over longer periods of time. So in terms of kind of disaster scenario, I'm thinking perhaps of Rob Nixon's idea around slow violence and kind of slow unfolding violence, or slow violence of radiation over time rather than a nuclear event. And I just wondered if there's any sort of temporal correlations between practice and process and object and event.
It's an interesting question. Oh yes. I mean, it never really occurred to me, which is stupid, that of course the whole notion of risk is future-oriented. I mean, that it's kind of like, if danger is like present, then risk is an attitude that is future-oriented, and that has certain stakes, I suppose, that we don't know what happens in the future, and that so the temporality is tied up with that. I mean, I don't know about slow and fast, but that struck me as something interesting. Do you want to?
So I think again, this list and this quote about the side effects of that drug is really important in the sense that risk has a tendency to expand and expand and expand and expand. And when you look at what the state agencies deal with, usually the assumption is that they should deal with something which is sudden, or the unspoken implication is people are dying all the time, but sometimes something sudden happens, and more people are dying at one point, and then we should have these forces which deal with that problem. But this category expands, and then suddenly we get into side effects of drugs, and then what, right? There aren't car accidents on that list, but why aren't they on that list? Not because people don't die from car accidents, it's just that they are dispersed and distributed. And this whole discourse of talking about, say, for example, slow disasters, in a way is, in my view, simply part of this endless undermining of the category of risk to include literally everything that could happen.
I just wanted to ask about the sort of psychology of feeling at risk, and to what extent you think kind of governmental agencies or state are trying to sort of manage danger or trying to manage fear. If that makes sense? So fear of danger as opposed to actual danger in the population.
Well, well, that's a small question, right? So, of course, well, without putting too fine a point on it, I mean, one of the things that, I mean, just think about the politics involved. I mean, one of the things it suits governments to do is to ramp up people's anxieties about certain kinds of risks and magnify risks. And because, of course, then it suits a certain kind of, how should I put it, management and control or cultivation of people's attitudes. So, you know, think about the way that tropes are used about the swarming of the immigrants from, you know, into the borders of the EU and so on and so forth, and the way. So just certain kinds of tropes are used in ways which are affectively anxiety-inducing to ramp up, so you kind of get an affect, and then of course it's presented in a way where you don't get any kind of fairly dispassionate characterization about the actual numbers, the proportion, the presentation, how much people, you know, immigrants tend to pay per capita way and above into the tax pool and so on and so forth. There's a kind of emotive, affective, anxiety ramping up trope in order to present these people as risks and actually magnify our sense of what is at risk, namely ourselves.
I think the important thing is to understand that these things are always tied up with each other, and the main problem is what to include. So if you, I don't bring it up now, but if you remember, for example, this UK risk register, so basically it sorts risks by the likelihood and the severity, but the issue isn't simply about, it pretends to be scientific in the sense that it tries to calculate something about these risks, but the main issue is which ones are included. And for example, the fact that terrorism is included obviously purely has something to do with fear and not with likelihood and severity, because obviously the risk people are dying in the UK from terrorism is so low that it literally doesn't matter. Right? Compared to, and you know, you can sometimes read about this, you know, the risk of falling down the stairs and dying is hundreds of times higher than being a victim of a terrorist attack. But falling down from the stairs isn't on the risk register. So the scientificity of these tables isn't, the problem of the scientificity of these tables isn't in the calculation, but what is on it and what isn't.
In the relationship that there might be between risk and gender. I was quite interested that one of the talkers spoke at an organisational level through genderless level, and the other two speakers actually spoke about both male and female artists in the presentations, and some of the works here seem very gender specific, such as Cut Piece or I'm Too Sad to Tell You, seem very heavily tied into the gender of the artist. So I'm just interested in thoughts that each of the presenters might have on the relationship between risk and gender.
It's an interesting question, and one that I didn't really focus on in this, although I think you know, my choice of Virginia Woolf as an artist who was, you know, vulnerable in certain ways, but who thought of her art as, you know, only being possible given a certain kind of passivity, receptivity in the face of what I'm calling contingency. But of course, you know, writing is a way of coping with that as well. And I think that she had that view of it, of not therapeutic, but of ordering and presenting stuff on a page, putting it, you know, out there. That was one way of getting by in my, yeah.
Thank you for that. So I guess one thought I have is that for obvious reasons, not just in art, women's place as being marginalised, or the tropes of gender have been used in ways which are, as it were, creatively speaking, undermining. So they tend to explain underperformance, lack of self-confidence, not as a generalisation, but that's true. And I deliberately chose Jane Margaret Cameron because actually, I think, although you can see that clearly she was pretty self-conceited, in a way, in that kind of environment, that's actually quite a good strategy, right? So there's a nice place in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics where he says something like this: if you tend to suffer from meekness, actually, aim for what you think arrogance is rather than bravery. Because if you're meek, what you will think is brave is actually not brave enough. Right? So I think, as it were, depending on where you're coming from, and it needn't be gender, it could be a whole bunch of other things. Gender is kind of one amongst many different kinds of things. But if you're coming from a place which is disadvantaged, or you're as it were, done down, not just consciously, but in various other kinds of ways, then actually there is, how should I put it, there's a lot to be said for the arrogance of youth as getting you somewhere, and that might, as it were, hit what, otherwise speaking, the truly courageous might aim at.
Just one point about the Swiss bunkers, which is really interesting in terms of gender, because the whole system of Swiss civil defense is, didn't talk about this, is based on the fact that every male Swiss citizen who doesn't go to the military because he's too meek becomes a member of the Swiss civil defense, meaning that the whole system of the bunkers depends on male members of Swiss society doing these exercises, how to live in bunkers. But obviously, in the case of nuclear attack, the Swiss society will be reduced to being a society consisting purely of households, because obviously there wouldn't be any universities, there wouldn't be any museums, there wouldn't be any banks, there wouldn't be any churches. Everyone would simply be living in a bunker, in a house. But as it happens so often, when it becomes serious, women are shoved away, and it's only the men who exercise this, and it would be the men who are in charge of running the bunkers. Because obviously they couldn't do their jobs anymore, so they would be the ones who, today it's spaghetti and now everyone goes to bed and so on and so forth. So it's quite an interesting version of a utopia or a dystopia in which society has lost everything that we would call functional differentiation, being reduced to eating and sleeping, but where usually this would be the place of women to deal with this, it's again the men.
Perhaps we've got time for one more question at this moment. Okay.
It's more a comment than about the differences between the practice of risk management or inventing risk and the practice of artists, that they somehow step back and allow contingency or chance to talk. It seems like, in a way, that the risk management is more creative than actually the artist. In a way, the risk management produce an whole infrastructure that creates risk as such, while the artists embrace this chance of this contingency. And going back to discourse of the temporalities, it's interesting how the risk management is so much focused in the future, but also in the past, because it's used as experience from the past to build up on the future, and our contingency in art is very much about the present. So these are like two so different and I think very complementary approach that perhaps can shed a bit of light of how we can understand risk and how artists can somehow teach us something about taking risk. And then the other thing I wanted to say on your idea of the risk-taking obviously is not always a positive thing. It's a little bit of an anecdote. I was researching about, because there's this kind of urban legend that says that the meaning of the word crisis in Chinese is made in a way that it means both danger and opportunity. And I was reading this article in which they were saying that this was used a lot in training for financial, like people like working in the financial market and traders, etc. And they were all introducing this rhetoric of how it was great to use crisis. And this is a very clear example of how they took too far the idea of risk-taking, because we can see the consequences of what like the financial market has produced by taking risks. That's all I don't know if you want to.
Can I have a quick comment? Yes, I like that example very much. But I did just want to say that actually, although very often in the art world people talk about risk-taking with the art and all that kind of stuff, I mean, actually, at least tacitly, the way that art schools carry on, the way that crit classes carry on, is actually all about trying to bed in, and actually it's done sometimes extremely well, sometimes it's done extremely badly. How shall I put it? Build up the character of these artists so that in the future they will be able to take the right kinds of risks, right? And you can set up creative environments in ways which, as it were, are going to either support people's development of their artistic personality, which will then enable them to go on to take the right kinds of risks, or actually it can actually be quite crippling or undermine it. So, you know, very different environments, set them up in different ways, see what the effects are, right? If you set up an environment which tends to be very negative orientated, highly critical, really hierarchically status orientated, for example, people tend to take less risks, they will tend to be less supportive, they will tend to, whereas if you take an environment which tends to be, in hierarchical terms, pretty flat, has to be critically sympathetic, all right? It can't just be, because otherwise it's meaningless and people realise it's meaningless. It has to be critically sympathetic. There's a whole bunch of other, what you might call key psychological conditions which set up what you might call, I think, art critical development for the development of what we might think of as the artistic personality, either in the right way or either going to give people problems or make it a much harder achievement for them to take risks. So it is tacitly at least future orientated in terms of what we do, and we should pay attention to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise this issue which you raised a little bit about Marina Abramovich being, you know, training herself and going through enormous, you know, care in the preparation for her performances, which are then, you know, a bit wide open, whatever. And this seems to me to be kind of a paradox that is embodied in Three Standard Stoppages, the Duchamp piece, that it is this elaborate instruction, you know, a sort of meter-long thread that you hold, you know, a meter high, and that, you know, that it's this ridiculously long-winded instruction in the service of capturing chance and, you know, the sort of wavy configuration that defeats the meter, you know. So there's this conjunction of rule, you know, instructions, preparation that generates out of that a chance encounter or whatever. Yeah.
I think I'm going to suggest that we go and have some lunch at this point. We'll start again at 2 o'clock. But could we again thank our speakers for 3 really excellent talks?
I take nuclear culture to be the whole nuclear cycle, so looking from uranium mining, weapons production, nuclear power and waste management, so the whole kind of cycle. So I was really interested to read Michael's paper, which I read on the train this morning, and there are a few kind of connecting factors perhaps that link this discussion about physiological risk or probabilistic risk and creative ideas about creative risk, from a kind of mortal risk sense to a risk of experimentation. So in some ways these are two quite different things, but maybe there's points where they come together. I was really interested in Michael's idea about producing risk, and that thinking about nuclear war and thinking about the role of art and nuclear war, we have to ask, are we more likely to have a nuclear war if we prepare for it? Probably. Are we more likely to have a nuclear war if we prepare for the risk of it, which perhaps is a slightly different thing? So preparing for nuclear war we might think as stockpiling nuclear weapons. Preparing for the risk of it we might think in a more civilian sense. But if preparing for nuclear war in a civilian sense, preparing for the risk, or trying to use any kind of probabilistic risk strategies, we have to ask, if we make images or films or texts about nuclear war, are we preparing, and therefore are we making nuclear war more likely by that preparation for it? And I think Joseph Masco writes about this quite interestingly in terms of visibility, and he would argue that the cultural investigation of the nuclear is a way of trying to make visible the nuclear economy that is otherwise made invisible. So I guess he would argue that the visualization and interrogation of nuclear risk is one that undermines its potential. But then we have to think about modes of resistance, and are modes of resistance something different? Are modes of resistance deployed, if I use this military term, to make risk visible, or are they part of the escalation of fear? Are they part of the manufacture of fear itself? And this is something we can really look at now in terms of Cold War scenarios, Cold War images, and think about the probabilistic risk of a nuclear weapon being exploded on a civilian population then versus now. So we have two contradictory pieces of knowledge here. One is that from 1945 until 96, 98, there have been over 2,000 atomic explosions on the planet through nuclear testing. So America specifically has dropped more weapons on itself than anyone has ever dropped on them. So if we think about this idea of fear, the manufacture of fear in terms of a Cold War binary of, the Russians are going to bomb us, or the Russians think the Americans are going to bomb them, actually that isn't the risk factor. The risk factor is bombing ourselves constantly. So, but that doesn't configure within a political manufacture of fear. So it's not used politically in a party political, state political sense. So the other scenario to think about now is that the United Nations research into the potential effects of an atomic weapons exchange has had to rethink the Cold War scenario. So no longer are they modelling the effects of that on a Russia-America exchange of weapons, but they're looking at a smaller scale exchange between two smaller rivaling countries. And the countries that they're looking at as a model, and I should stress this, is as a model. This is not a prediction of the next Third World War, but, well, I guess we're already in that, but in terms of an atomic war, the prediction is a small-scale exchange between Pakistan and India. And the implications of that exchange are, of course, drastically, I can't find the words, but devastating for those individual countries. But the global modelling is the effect of fallout on global food production. So again, our risk assessment of nuclear war in the UK is not on a Cold War binary, even though those Cold War binaries are now being played out very directly through the Middle East. And we shouldn't underestimate that history there. The risk assessment is about the reduction in rice and grain food production on the planet. So we're often kind of looking in the wrong place, if you like, at what the risk might be, or these are many ideas that Michael raised, I think, or his paper, which I read the paper, I didn't use it, raised about what kinds of risk we're looking at and how one set of risk assessment or risk analysis might be used for another risk analysis. But there were two really strong images that I wanted to just talk about as an introduction to your work. The first being this idea of the nuclear as world-making. And we often see from Maholy Naj's painting of Nuclear 1 and Nuclear 2 that he painted in 1945, just after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he painted the whole globe as a nuclear globe. So it's this knowledge that once atomic fission has been invented, it can't be uninvented. Once radioactive materials are released into the world, they cannot be re-contained. And this is a really important debate in terms of the Anthropocene. So radionuclides now are not just radionuclides, they're anthropogenic radionuclides, because these are evidence of human activity that we don't trace to a very specific moment in time. And so perhaps the nuclear, more than any other kind of risk factor, is kind of world-making. It's a human marker of human evidence on the planet that will be detectable in hundreds and thousands of years, way over any other kind of human activity. So it's this kind of world-makingness of nuclear risk that I think is really interesting. And I know, Peter, that many of your works kind of have this globe and this world, and maybe we could start to think about those ideas and look at some of your work that you've brought with you. We didn't manage to have lunch, so I don't know how my introduction connects up with what you thought, but I'm sure we'll work that one out.
I might not actually show what I bought. I mean, I've actually just bought the stuff that is on the wall here, because I did roll up a whole lot of posters last night and left them on a bus, so it's been through the blood. But
lucky the one that gets in the bus.
There's a whole lot.
If you see a lot of Peter's work on eBay, you buy it all back and sell it back.
But one of the things we're talking about, the sort of naturalizing nuclear weapons. One of the reasons I started making sort of anti-nuclear images was because the image of nuclear weapons was there was a photogenic image of the mushroom cloud that was actually on sale at a place called Athena, where they used to have poster shops. And it was the 5th most popular poster in the late 70s, early 80s, with an enormous mushroom cloud all airbrushed and looking very beautiful. And this was a poster to put with no words on it, to put up in your bedroom. You know, so, and what happened is that the anti-nuclear movement started, and they were just getting like I was getting stuff from the MOD, we were just getting pictures of missiles and pictures, and they were using them straight. So the idea that I had was to always was to break them in some way, or to show, very simply, to show a connection. If you show a mushroom cloud, you show a skeleton. And but the whole question that you were talking about in terms of making images came up because when I started working with CND, a lot of people there wanted to show, they thought to get people involved, you should show what you want, not images of, the horrible times we're in, but the good old times, the way Brett talked about that. And they wanted rainbows and things, so you invent a utopia which doesn't exist through idealistic images. And so there was a lot of, at that time there was a lot of arguments about whether tough imagery, actually showing what these things are about, will put people, young people off. And my feeling was that it wouldn't, that to get people involved, because that's always been one of the basic reasons for my stuff, is to get people thinking critically.
Yeah,
you know,
provocation.
Yeah, and getting young people to see, you know, it's the images that are normally separate in our society. By joining them, they can actually see some connections going on that aren't in the Daily Mail or whatever, you know. So.
But you've also used art in that way. If we think of the Haywain, and this is the first image of yours that I came across as a child, teenager in the anti-nuclear movement, were the nuclear missiles in the back of Constable's Haywain. So as an archetypal anti-nuclear image, and of course an archetypal image of English romantic landscape, maybe you can say a little bit about how you brought those two things together.
Well, they actually came together because I was commissioned by a magazine called Camera Work, which was a collective. And I think it's the basis of a lot of my work is about collaboration and collectives and people working together. And that was a sort of photography collective in the 70s and 80s. And anyway, they wanted me to do a sort of spread in this magazine. So I took an essay by E.P. Thompson, which at that time he was making connections between domestic police violence and nuclear weapons, and he wrote an essay that connected Blair Peach, who was killed by the Special Patrol Group on a march, who was an anti-fascist campaigner, and he made a connection between that and the surveillance and the coming to Britain of nuclear cruise missiles. So somehow these sort of things connected in my head, and one of the things about making work as an artist is that you've got a tiny little bit of the available economic and visual market. It's all, you know, even more so now, every year it's more and more corporate, everything in public space. So if you make something against it, you've got to make something that people can see very clearly, you know, and it's not subtle. I mean, people don't often accuse my work of being subtle, you know.
But in a way that's maybe the most subtle piece is the Haywain. I don't know.
It was funny because I've got it up in I've got this show at the Imperial War Museum, sort of, and a woman emailed me last week saying that she was in Greenham Common as in the army there, and they got an edict from their commander of their group saying, if you get any of these postcards, give them back to us immediately. And it was an image of the Haywain with the cruise missiles on. So they were actually someone was sending them into Greenham Common, and they were deemed as being very dangerous by the establishment there. And that's been the best uses of it have been the subliminal uses of it. You know, people buying it and sending it, saying this is the Haywain, and then realising it's got cruise missiles on it, and you know, so it's got that injection into society.
Well, at the time, Michael Heseltine said that cruise would melt into the countryside.
Yeah.
This was a kind of famous quote.
And, not that we would melt.
No, not that we would melt. But cruise would melt.
Yeah.
And so your image really, I think you made your image before he made that statement, but but it actually came about that kind of idea.
Yeah, and it came about through the Ministry of Defence produced a leaflet for people that lived near Greenham, where these things were going to circulate, and it had a watercolour of the cruise missile on it in the countryside, which is done by a Ministry of Defence watercolourist, you know, probably one of my ex-students, probably. You know. Got a job at the MOD, but so they'd used the media of you know, the rural Britain, which is always watercolour in that sense,
well,
and they turned it.
Salisbury Plain, so
yeah.
Cruise was based at Greenham Common as a base, but its exercise where it went to practice being as if it might send a nuclear weapon off towards Russia was actually Salisbury Plain. So they would drive through the night, through Berkshire, into Wiltshire, and go and hide in some woods on Salisbury Plain. So
Yeah.
they were in this bucolic landscape, albeit a military range.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And of course the great days down there were when, you know, the Women's Peace Camp was an amazing protest that's reverberated ever since as a form of protest. But there were these weekends when we all went down there and the whole fence got covered with material, which was, you know, from pieces of, you know, like tapestry and drawings and corn and the whole thing. So you got these amazing, the sort of humanity outside and then the concrete bunkers inside. It was an amazing dialectic that was coming through.
And that asymmetry, I think, is really important and comes up in a lot of your work. I guess this asymmetry between different kinds of power relations, hierarchical power relations, and how you might break or subvert a hierarchical power relation in terms to nuclear weapons, or maybe in terms of Tony Blair, you know, photographing the clouds of oil smoke. And so your work's kind of always, I mean, in internet terms now we call it a meme generator. You know, Peter Kellogg, the meme.
Oh yeah, what does that mean? I've been trying to find out.
Your image of Tony Blair. Photo.
Yeah,
you know the image we're talking about, him, Tony Blair taking a selfie of himself with clouds and billows of smoke. That is your work.
Yeah, me and Kat Phillips. It was a collaborative piece. Yeah.
I ask you, slightly addressed, but I ask you if it is your work because this is the nature of a meme. So you and Kat Phillips create this image and it circulates online. It circulates. It becomes detached from you. It's detached from your practice. But it circulates through Twitter, through Facebook, through social media. It's appropriated and reappropriated in millions of different contexts. It absolutely captures the moment, and as a something that's circulated that becomes detached as a form of art production, it just becomes this kind of ubiquitous concept of a particular moment in time. I think that's what we understand as a meme. We always have cat memes, but and memes have become commodified now with text. So you have an image and text to make a very specific political point. But you tend not to use text in your work. You do sometimes, but you tend to rely on the image. And I wondered if you could say something around the strength of the image and your... Because,
well, the ones in the show here have got text which are all government reports from nurses and doctors, because that was it was needed because it was for the GLC, and they had to argue for doing something on civil defence that wasn't an opinion, but was sort of came from, you know, very reputable sources. But usually, I mean, I feel it's the image that if you can do it with the image, then you don't dictate through the text or direct. The image, the conjunction of different elements in the image, usually just one or two, create the third meaning, and that is enough. And that is much more open for people to interpret in their own way and to take in their own way than if you tell them. You know, I have had, by the Haywain one, CND did one, and it said in enormous letters, "No nuclear weapons." On top, it was a killer bit of Saatchi cleverness there, not. But that killed the image, because you don't need to be told that. If it's going to work on people, it's going to make them think and act, and that's what I try and do, you know. And I get emails from people saying, you know, I saw your work 20 years ago, and then I thought, you know, joined Amnesty or something like that. And that's the sort of effect. And if you'd been full of text on it and telling people what to think, I don't think that would have worked in the same way. I mean, I have done it for a thing at the Imperial Order. I have done a thing with a lot of numbers, which are all statistics. And one of the reasons for that was there's tons of young people and kids go there, and statistics and numbers can actually engage them in looking at images. You know, it's sort of based on that audience in that sense. So, but.
Are we all right for time for a few minutes? I'm slightly confused now because our time sort of moved around a bit. Okay, I was thinking again, going back to the Haywain, but also maybe this connects up with some of your other works. This idea of the atomic sublime. So if we take the world-making image, or the idea, it's really an American concept of the atomic sublime, where the atomic is part of nature, as you say. It's a form of naturalizing the explosion. If we think of the Athena poster of the atomic explosion, just completely on its own without any text, it's presented as spectacle, as a kind of phenomenon, a man-made or perhaps natural phenomenon. And then we have the lived experience of radiation, which is much more uncanny, where through accidents, through leakage, through living next to a power station or a weapons plant, you might have this uncanny sense of the contamination of objects, or the contamination of food, or contamination of water. It depends where you are. I spent a few months in Fukushima recently, so I had this sense of the uncanny. You know, even though I carry a guide counter with me, you're still spooked and haunted, and it's a very different understanding of contamination in a very domestic sense. And so the Haywain brings these weapons into a very domestic, not even an uncanny, but a kind of mid-ground, perhaps a radioactive mid-ground, somewhere between the sublime, which is beyond the picturesque, it's external, it's a long way away, it's something that we view through a frame, to an experience of the nuclear that is very pastoral or domestic in some way. Your images often kind of collapse this distance or collapse this scale by bringing this sort of sublime understanding of the world making idea of the nuclear and this sort of hauntedness, and I don't know if that has a resonance with your pieces.
No, I mean, I think that's the point. Well, that's what I try and do, is bring our everyday, which is a sort of, for a lot of us, it's quite a privileged everyday, to bring that in relation to what's going on in the world, where people are, oppressed on whatever level, whether it's going to food banks or refugees, but you have to make that relate in some ways, not distant, as part of one's experience, and that's what I suppose montage is about, because you're bringing elements that are usually kept very separate in our media. You're actually bringing them together, and the fact that they are separate is no accident, obviously. Because you've got advertising, then you've got summer holiday stuff, and you used to have a lot of pictures of, they used to have war in, say, colour mags. They've got rid of even, that's really nearly totally gone now, because that affects the selling of commodities. So, you'd think that because we've got the internet, we have this conglomeration of the joining of images, but we don't have that enough, I think, and it's up to, and now everyone can do it through things like Photoshop as well. It's really important that people do actually connect stuff, I think. And I do a lot of workshops with people, non-artists and youth groups and different groups, and it's often an amazing revelation to people when we have piles of newspapers and magazines and pictures they get off the internet. They start breaking them together, and you start thinking it through that. They start thinking about their own relationship to it and realise they can put themselves into an image, and they're part of that image. They're not separate. It's a way of actually connecting people to thinking they have got some power in their lives. I think that's really important use of it.
Can you say a little bit more about that practical process of making? And I love the way you talk about breaking images, and how you kind of break and meld images, and because just keep going back to this flare image, because it seems like such a digital image now, and you're the majority of your work is, again, well, I don't know, is the Blair image?
Yeah, that is digital. That one.
That's digitally constructed, totally.
Yeah.
But most of your work is, you know, paper cut and paste.
Yeah,
and
it was.
Tell us a bit more about your work.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't actually do Photoshop. It's not because I'm, you know, against it, but I just can't deal with the fact of all these buttons and layers of things. I'm so used to having stuff, you know, and then my stuff's always very concerned with sort of materiality of the thing, of different sorts of photographic image and things. So I work with people who can deal with it, and then when they're brought together, there isn't actually a big difference between the cut ones and the uncut and the digital ones, other than the fact there isn't really an original like for the Blair one. It's out there in the world, so there's no original for it. I mean, I suppose with that one's been used. I mean, recently a Turkish magazine used it on the cover, but instead of the explosion behind, they had some of a soldier that was killed, and they had Erdogan, the president, prime minister of Turkey, on the front, and he banned, he actually arrested the editor and banned the magazine, and then he made a speech saying that he'd never taken a selfie, and so it was completely took it literally. And some people actually do take that image literally as well, thinking it is Tony Blair. So that's why it works, because the horror and the bloodthirstiness and the sort of madness of the man is sort of encapsulated in that look that he's got there. Yeah. But
well, I think you've touched on this issue of personal risk as an artist, which was touched on as well in Sophia's talk, but we're going to need to wrap up now and then join the rest of the panel for a discussion.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very practical. You can hear me now? Yes. So yeah, I wish I was talking about someone else and I could be informed, detached, and not take any risk. But unfortunately, I'm gonna try to talk about our work and actually, as the artist talk is a kind of exercise that is somehow paradoxical, because the artist is not the person that is better placed to talk about one's work, in the sense that one doesn't have the right distance from it. So I'm gonna try something new here, and I'm gonna tell you some things about what we do and show you some works alternatively, as essentially the method that we use is trying to disarticulate the relationship between image and discourse, to explode the hierarchy that always makes the illustration one the illustration of the other, or the explanation of the other. So we already try to function in a space where we also produce text, essays, and texts of other natures, which are sometimes also in conflict with our visual work, or in a relationship that is not exactly pacified. So I've decided to begin with this work, which is from 2012, and it's a work that was exhibited in Rome, and is a work about hope, because I think one of the worst risks that an artist can incur is to lose hope in things, and it's very easy actually to lose hope, especially these times. This work reads "But My Love Never Dies." And it's inspired by a book that had this title and was written by several authors and published in 1971. There was an operation launched to confiscate it by the police, but it couldn't be done somehow because when they've arrived, the copies were already all sold out. The book has been republished several times, and recently by the Riva Prodi still available, and it includes recipes for subversive actions, for reappropriation of one's body and health, and it kind of describes the psychedelic atmosphere of human adventures and resistance to the police attacks of the 70s, although it was already a sort of declining moment. So, yeah, I mean, one should, after Fitzgerald, be able to focus on two contradictory ideas at the same time without losing the capacity to function. That's what he says in The Crack Up. I quote him, one should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. This was somehow the starting point of Clairefontaine, of the project of Clairefontaine, because we confessed ourselves the political impotency of all of us as a crack-up, but at the same time we tried to keep living and thinking with this fact in mind. And it has appeared clearly to us that the question of hope was deeply connected to the question of love, and the question of love was related to conflicts and the struggle balance between sexes and genders and classes, of course. Therefore, with the processes of subjectivization that make us identify with a group of people rather than another. That's why we also use this device where we don't sign of our own names, but we say that we are, James and I, the founder of Clairefontaine, we are the assistants of these sort of hollow artists. And here, this is a work from 2010. And it's composed with neon lights. I mean, here they're concealed, but in all the disciplinary spaces, productive or school spaces, or in prison, in factories, you usually have this neon lighting, which come in 3 sizes, and it's very easy to compose an anonymous alphabet with them, as like a homemade neon sign. And this is, of course, a work that can be interpreted in several ways, and that mainly, I would say, talks about nostalgia. Then this is a work that you might have seen or you might know already. It's a work from 2011. It's called PIGS, which was the acronym that the Monetary Fund gave to the first 4 countries that defaulted the Eurozone. So it was Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, which are whose shapes are replicated here. You see quite pale, but they're made of stick matches. They're matches that are planted in the wall by hand, of course. So one has to drill the holes and then put the matches in. The workforce is always voluntary workforce, so we ask the museum, in this case, it was the Musac in León in Spain, people to come to help with this kind of industrial labor process, and then the curator has to set fire to the thing. It has to happen indoors because one of the main aspects of the work is the smell, the 2 immaterial things of it, which is the labor that helps it happen to put the matches in the wall, and the smell that stays in the white cube and completely destroys the atmosphere of the white cube that is asepticized, are the 2 major elements of this work. So the performance itself is not visible. People are not supposed to be present at the moment of the lighting of the thing. First of all, because there is too much smoke, and second, because the purpose of this work is not spectacular, is actually to confront you more with the aftermath, which looks like this. So that's what people really see, this scorched and destroyed trace of this multitude of matches that were constituting the 3 shapes of the countries. This is a work from 2008. which is a work that is alternatively it has two superimposed neons basically that you don't see. You know, they light alternatively, they never light together, and they say divide the divided, or divide the division, and they are in Hebrew and Arabic. Of course, it's a work that has been inspired by the notion that St. Paul has of divide the divided, divide the divisions that are already there, and yeah, it was, this expression was first used by him to cut the original division that every law creates because of its simple existence. In this particular case, the division that he wanted to divide, in the case of St. Paul, was the one between Jewish and non-Jewish people, between circumcised and non-circumcised people, but we were interested also in another aspect of this expression, because Agamben explains it in his book, The Time That Is Left, that Walter Benjamin described a similar gesture of subtle subdivision, quoting the example of Apelles' line, which was in one of the arcade project fragments. It says, like a line divided by Apelles' cut perceives its division beside itself. And it's a legend that you probably know about Pliny the Elder, that writes in his Natural History that Apelles sailed to Rhodes in eagerness to see the painting of Protogenes, previously known to him only by reputation. He was like the fancy painter of the time, the hot guy. And when he arrived at Protogenes' workshop, he found the artist absent, but a large blank panel fixed to the easel, ready for painting. The old woman who watched over the workshop informed him that Protogenes was not there, and inquired who she should say had been looking for him. From this, answered Apelles, and taking up a brush, he painted a colored line of extreme thinness on the panel. When Protogenes returned, he contemplated the exactness of the line and announced that it was Apelles who had arrived, because no other painter could produce such a perfect work. So he then painted an even thinner line in another color on the first one, and as he was going away again, bid the old woman to show the line to Apelles if he returned, and to add that this was the person Apelles was looking for. Apelles did return, and in embarrassment at being beaten, he placed another line in a third color on top of the first two, so that there was no more room for a display of precision. Protogenes then confessed his defeat and flew to the harbor to find Apelles. He decided that the panel should be preserved for posterity, like the invention of minimalism, just as it was, to serve as a source of special amazement, not just for anybody, but for artists. Pliny confirms that Protogenes' judgment by adding that before the painting was destroyed in the burning of Caesar's palace on the Palatine. It had been greatly admired because containing nothing but almost invisible lines and appearing like a blank space among the other paintings, it enticed viewers and became more renowned than any other work. So, all of this is lost, of course, for the viewer that looks at this work, but it refers to other reality in which human judgment should be as refined and subtle as this encounter of these two minds and these two painters was, and this is what we were probably wishing for in this work that is also a sort of light that alternatively lights up in a kind of soft and gentle way. We talk about, when we talk about love, which is something that comes back recurrently in our work, we don't talk about love conceived as a personal experience, but as a possibility that is always left open, a bridge between the universal and the particular, the subjective and the collective. So, of course, this is a panel created with burned, text, the most ephemeral and sort of poor way to write. This is the trace that the flame leaves, and this was part of a project that has been attacked by a group of fascists in Bolzano, where we had put this sign inside a little space that was closed, but it had vitrines all around it. So this was our intervention. We were invited by the Museum of Bolzano, and they tried to get this censored, but they couldn't, because it's not illegal to say that one loves communism. It was accompanied by the text that is entitled "We are all whatever singularities." They managed to destroy all the copies of that text, but anyway, the museum put it on their website. We also try to explore one key point that is the base where all our sense of security sits and rests, basically. And it's the main obstacle at the same time for being together and sharing things, time and opportunities, which is private property. So we always stumble onto this. Of course, we don't have any answers. We don't have any moral judgment on these things, but we explore them because we always see ourselves as part of the same problem that we explore, so. Yeah, we try to explore the relationship also between communism and love, and to see how private property as an idea, as a need and an institution blocks this. Essentially, I mean, I don't know if you've read this beautiful book by Rancière that is entitled Short Voyages in the Land of the People. He talks about projections of utopian poets and writers, and he describes an idyll between Rilke and a working class girl called Martha, and basically he describes the impossibility of this love affair, but he concludes saying that once the woman in flesh and bones is abandoned, the love affair becomes possible as a poem. It's transfigured into poetic substance. So this is what also art does. When something is impossible, it preserves it as a fossil of something that never really happened but partly happened. And we are curious of this process and scared of this process, of course. And in the same book, Rancière says that what is lacking between cultivated people, between intellectual and poor people, and what separates and what doesn't keep them together is what keeps anyone together, which is love. There is no love between bourgeois people, intellectual people, and poor people. He sees basically class struggle as the result of a lack of affection and love for each other, of people of different groups, which is a kind of courageous thing to say for somebody that has been diving into archives of illiterate people and workers, etc. And I always keep this thing in mind. This is I put this in the slideshow partly because it's a failed work. It's a work we've never shown again, and it hasn't taken its precise shape. It was kind of abandoned there somehow when we took this picture. It's from 2007, but it doesn't stop being prophetic since, because these are, of course, the same hats that the security guard wear, and rather than having security on them, it has anxiety. So we've also worked a lot on the metaphor of the closed doors. You know, what does it mean when you're kept out of something? What does it mean when you close yourself, like Virginia Woolf said in this oyster of your private space? She had this incredible sensibility for the interiority and what it has of claustrophobic and of splendid at the same time. So What does it mean to have all these protections, these things that prevent us from being invaded, from being attacked, from being attempted to? And these are actually, I don't know, you will see that pretty well actually. These are keys that one cannot buy in the market. They belong to locksmiths. That use them to force locks when one has lost the key or when the lock is blocked. So there are all operations that are performed and allow people to open any possible lock without infraction. So this is also a sport that is called lock picking. We made an artist book on lock picking techniques, and it's very much related to a Zen discipline somehow, because it's all about visualizing what is inside the lock and your action through this tool onto the sensitive parts of the inside of the lock. So it's something that is a very delicate operation that has some erotic aspects to it, and also it's to do with one's breathing and one's capacity to imagine something that is hidden. Always in a similar spirit. This is a work from 2010 in particular. This is from the same space where the first neon sign I've shown you was exhibited. This is a molding technique, much more simple, that is used by the FBI. These are the metal that is composing the pieces of the key is an alloy, and it's not so strong. So these keys, if they're used to open the space, they will not be usable a second time. So these are the keys of a gallery we've realized that gave us their keys to mold. So there is a relationship of trust with us, of course, because they also give us all the codes of the alarm, etc. with it. And but we did it also with museum keys. They're not as easygoing as private galleries, but yeah, I mean, just to realize the work, the owner of the space has to give you the keys of their space, and then the person that buys it, if somebody buys it, has the possibility to destroy the artwork by using the key to break in legally, to open legally the lock, or keep the artwork as what it is, a non-functional object. This is more recent work. I don't know what we're doing with time. I guess maybe I'm going to cut it a little shorter than I thought. This is a more recent... We have time. Okay. Because afterwards I would like to show the film that made me encounter with Laura, because it's it's an interesting film about danger, I would say, and self-defense and the capacity of being freed of fear. This is a recent work from 2015, and we're interested almost in all the devices that make people feel safe, and this is something very British that you all know probably in this audience. It's anti-climb paint. So this paint never dries, and people put it over their fences because it's also slippery and disgusting, and it exists in these three colors. And we have painted monochromes with this, essentially. And by doing that, we have ordered this paint because we wanted to see what it looked like, and we were fascinated by it. It's got something organic and very strange about it, because it looks like some fluid once it's applied on a flat surface, because it kind of keeps this runniness, this fragility that makes it look like something that is alive. So obviously these monochromes suffer the the intervention of the public that can be vandalistic or an accident or whatever. They also suffer the aging because dust deposits on them and insects stick on them sometimes. So there's somehow the opposite of a painting, which is the safest artwork to live with somehow, because it goes on the wall and you don't have to think about it anymore. These ones are always in a sort of, they're called fresh monochromes, they're always in a sort of state of childhood, and they also question the position of the author, because as an owner, as a caretaker of these paintings, you can decide to restore them, but then you become somehow the author of the painting too. So it's like an open work, and it's also a work that can leave you stained and soiled and has this kind of dirt about it that is also interesting. Here there is one all by himself that you can see how slimy and runny it looks. So, as I was saying, we've always tried to place ourselves in a non-moralistic position, and especially to explore all these aspects of exclusion, the difficulties that we experience to accept people, because these difficulties are there. The fear of the refugees is there, is produced, it's fed, but it is there. So saying that it's not would be wrong. Saying that it doesn't have any right to be would be wrong. And we are also victim of this kind of passions, feelings. So we speak from inside, and the struggle balance that results from these antipathies, from these incapacities to tolerate the presence of and the access of people to things, the need that we have to limit things, not to make them really accessible and not to open them to everyone. And we found that one of the main knots in this, we are talking about affects here, we're not making an anthropological analysis of culture, is the link between identity and property, which is, of course, something that politically also has a codification, but it's more and more accepted. It goes without saying somehow. And this is dangerous, we think, and the obscure links that are from being from some place and owning more or less a language, having property of language, you say, knowledge related to a place. So essentially being a foreigner it has become a very interesting concept to work on, not only for our personal experience, but as a prism of reading of reality. What does the foreigner say? And German literature has a sort of codification of this. I was talking about that with a friend yesterday, but Deleuze and Guattari, for example, in their book on Kafka, have a fantastic expression that really appeals to us. They say it would be good to write books like A Dog Digs a Hole. It would be good to do it as somebody walks on the tightrope. And this basically is finding a foreign language within the language. It's kind of unlearning the things that we know how to do well and giving ourselves some difficulties, putting ourselves in a position where we become the foreigner, but in a way that is more irreparable, more irreversible than if we just left our country or our securities or our class. So from this, we've done a whole series. This is from 2010. It's still ongoing of neon signs that say "read foreigners everywhere," but in several languages, with the ambiguity that this message has. Of course, they work wonderfully in the public space, because that's where they really compose with the surrounding reality, and they have a different meaning every time they are exhibited. For example, we've exhibited the foreigners everywhere everywhere in Arabic in 2001 in the vitrine of a space that was in the Lower East Side, Ruinas Paulins in New York, and they lost their space. They didn't renew their lease because of that, because the Jewish neighborhood didn't like it. Even if they put the translation at the window, they just couldn't accept it. In other situations, it's been a work that has created a lot of reactions of aggressivity and vandalism sometimes. Here you see some images, not these, but all of these, from a neighborhood where we lived a long time, a very mixed neighborhood in Belleville. As a matter of fact, a neighborhood where one of the terroristic attacks took place, the one in the Carillon and Petit Cambodge, is Belleville. And we've worked, it was for an event called Nuit Blanche, White Night in Paris, that takes place every year. So we work with the local population to install these signs, sometimes plugged in their apartment for the night. We tried to put the different languages in the places where we knew that people from that ethnic group lived. So here, for example, it's a Romani website, like a gypsy Romani sign, sorry, like a gypsy language. This is in Arabic. The neighborhood was undergoing very heavy gentrification, so you see some missing buildings that look like missing teeth or something horrendous about it, and some things that are already restored and some things that are in the process of being restored / demolished, and now it's all clean and lots of these spaces no longer exist. And this is in Tibetan language, and this is in Greek. And yeah, I mean, we've worked since then. We talk about 2010, the first time we've made these signs. In 2015, we've opened this exhibition in Air de Paris in Paris. It opened in October, in October, and is still on the end of October. And now, one of the signs, one of the works that is in the show is this sign. That is a quote from Kafka's Castle, and it's something they say to Kay, the main character of the novel, which is an outsider, but also probably a Jew. We don't fully understand, and he awakens the worst passions in all the people of the village and the castle. But essentially, yeah, I mean, in retrospect, it was quite almost prophetic. We were thinking about the refugees, of course, when we decided to give shape to this work that has been haunting us. This quote has been haunting us for a long time, for reasons that are not completely understandable to ourselves either. And so, yeah, as I was saying, we're not interested in finding the perfect expression of a problem that could replace the research for its solution, it's funny, it's this quote, I don't remember I put it in, but in Rancière says, always in short voyages in the land of the poor, of the people, he says, that something, it's difficult to translate it into English, but he says the accomplished poetry, the perfect conjunction it reaches is always only made of words, and the joyful space of the word that hits the nail on the head is paid at the price of the agreed solitude, of the inevitable solitude. So this is something we are not interested in, and it's probably something we pay the price for, but probably it is because of the impotency of words, even the most appropriate words, that institutions have to exist. That's how we see it. And institutions never institute links, but they certify through their simple presence the division and the separation. They sanction the feelings of hatred that they're supposed to provide an impossible remedy for, but they cause other feelings of hatred. I'll show you some excerpts of the movie after this. This is a work from 2011, like a year where there were a lot of foreclosures in the States. It's a battering ram. It's actually an artisanally produced object. And it's the thing they use, to break into the door. It weighs, I don't know how much it weighs. It weighs a lot. We installed it like Naumann installed the chair for a prisoner, which is his work. He says his only work that is explicitly politically loaded. So it's suspended in the space through cables, and of course one cannot walk around it. It was difficult to get this object, actually. There aren't very many around, and they ask you a lot of questions when you want to get it, because somehow it's something you shouldn't own. And this is also interesting. It's not reserved to the police forces, because lots of private security people have it, because most of the foreclosures are made by the private policemen. But yeah, a private citizen shouldn't own this. It took a long time to get it. And this is a work, strangely, from the same year. I didn't realize that when I put in the slideshow, and it's called Missing. These are sawn off barrels of shotguns. It's a common practice to conceal. If you want to conceal a shotgun in your coat, you've got to saw off the barrel. It's a weapon that is much more powerful than other shooting weapons, and can be more discreet than the omnipresent in the press now AK-47. So of course it's not precise, so it's highly dangerous, because a shooting with this kind of weapon just explodes everything around. These are from Mexico. We had to get the weapons, and we got them sewn off. This also was a complicated work to make, and we were interested in knowing how difficult it is to get weapons to get this job done, because you can't do it in your own house. You've got to go to locksmith, to some people that have the right tools. We did it, so that's the work. And now I'll show you some excerpts of this movie. That is a movie from 2011 too, and I hope it runs okay. Perfect. So. And it's a movie we've realized in New York. It's shot inside the gallery where we had the exhibition at night. It was Metro Pictures at the time. So it takes place in a white cube, and it's essentially a restaging of a video, like a DVD on self-defense. On street fighting. I don't know if you know that such a thing exists. Basically, is this idea of self-defense, of reappropriating violence, and we found it absolutely incredible and insane on so many levels, especially the beginning, where the protagonist, who is actually Jim Fletcher, which is a very famous and amazing theater actor, who's a friend of ours, who's never punched anyone, so it took a long training to teach him how to perform the actions. He was really completely not professional. We had people to coach him on that. He shows all the objects that can be used as weapons. So it's a sort of transfiguration of the landscape.
Welcome to my lethal street fighting self-defense system. Let me tell you first that I've been around. I've been a bouncer for many, many years, and I've been fighting in the ring, as you know. So I know my things. All the techniques that I'm going to show you today, they actually work. I use them, so you can use them too. My first thing that I want to tell you is to keep your eyes on your opponent. Always. Never look away from your opponent. Because if you look away, you cannot see the glass coming, or the hit, or the baseball bat, or what about the shin kick in the head? No, keep your eyes open so at least you can go with the punch. This is very important. Also, I want you to look at his hand. What is he carrying in his hand? Is he holding a beer bottle? Is he drinking a beer? Hey, that's a weapon right there, because you can hit the beer bottle on your head. Is he drinking a nice little soda? Hey, that's a weapon too, because he can crush it, stab it in your face. Now, with this being like talking to you for like 2 minutes, if you didn't see me holding this knife, you could have been dead, my friend, because I can play the innocent person. I could say, look, sir, I really don't want any of this, and I go, woo, like this, and it's at your throat, and it's over and out, okay? With this said, keep your eyes open. Look what he's carrying in his hands. It's very important. We're going to start. Get ready. Okay, and here we are. We are in a happening place, so you will hear background music and noises, but pay attention to me, that is, and not to the people sitting in the back or the cars on the street, okay? Now, let's go. There are many weapons that you can use. Weapons, I call them weapons. Glass, very dangerous. You can stab it right in front of somebody's face. Then we have, of course, the pepper and salt. Now, if you have the time to shoot this thing off underneath the table and you put the pepper in your hand, you can throw it at him and then you can attack. It can blind him, okay? At least for a little bit. The salt thing, nothing really is going to happen, but it's a nice little thing to hold in your hand and punch a guy with, or just throw it at him as a defense so that he blocks and you attack right away with the right, straight, left hook and all the finishing combinations from the big book of combat. Now this, what can you do with this? What'd you say? Same thing, distraction. Throw it and it'll work. This thing, very violent. Take a look at this metal, ladies and gentlemen, and this is metal. You can now punch, you can hit, you can stab it like this. That's a great weapon right here, okay? And you won't break your knuckles, by the way, because you're holding something. This is a very strong weapon. Now, also a very strong weapon, and it happened one time at a restaurant when I was eating. I saw a waiter putting some hot sauce on somebody's food, and he dropped one little drop of hot sauce into his eye, and the eye from the customer, and the guy was screaming from pain. It didn't work. So, if you have the chance, well, unbutter this thing and square it into his face. Better yet, square it on your fingers, and the first confrontation with him, smear it in his eyes. Okay, those are the weapons. Come with me. We have a little bit more. Of course.
It's what was I wanting to say? Yeah, this is also real things. It's not fiction in the sense that all these things can be done. So the work also worked as a leakage of information to the audience that can actually, I mean, the cameraman was attacked during the filming. One night he was coming back home and he used one of these combinations and he said it worked. It was this big. So I suppose they worked. We didn't try them. Do I have time to show another bit? It's finished. Okay, so there it goes. Okay.
Just head forward, then I can slip over to his eyes, put my fingers in his eyes, and I bet you that he's going to go back and support the jaw and elbow under the jaw.
Ah, I'm sorry, this is not the same. Like.
I have that too, and he can
Yeah,
also
it doesn't
can
stop
do
at the right
this,
point. It doesn't stop at the right point. I will try it again. Yeah.
Now this is a situation I picked up from my couple of girlfriends, and I'm going to show you this situation. By the way, these girls have way more ways to defend knives, knife attacks, weapon attacks. So I suggest you to go seek them out and find them. They know a lot of things. I show you only one thing that they showed me, and I'm going to try to show you as right, as good as possible. Now you see, we switch the knife around. We're not going to take any risk, okay? Now, the arm that he doesn't see coming, this arm he will see coming because he's right there over my shoulder. This arm he won't see coming. We grab, and now he already can't move it. But just to make sure, we grab this arm also. Now we have total control. He cannot move that knife around, but that's not everything because he tried to kill me. So I gotta return the favor. Watch what I do. I step underneath here, and now I'm controlling him with my head, and I can stab his own knife here in the liver. There's no way he can go. I'm pushing with my head to the side, and I'm controlling his wrist. He cannot go anywhere. Stab in the liver.
So I guess I have to wrap this up. Thank you.
We arrive extruded into a cold, breathing, oxygenated world with a startle reflex so primitive and so universal that we may share with our single-cell forebears this shiver that comes of a membrane pricked, of a brush with some semi-solid that disrupts here and there an essential calcium ion circuit. From the start, then, alarms have been, in all senses, electric, and subject from the start, like other circuits, to unsteady or broken connections and false alarms. Is the gride a false alarm? Aside perhaps from the cry of an infant abandoned, the gride, G-R-I-D-E, is the one sound that prompts a universal human reaction. That is to say, so far as we know, among people with a healthy neurological and otological status, the gride produces the same response. Hackles at the back of the neck rise, we shiver and become uneasy, anxious, displeased. The gride. What is that sound? The gride is the name for the sound most familiar to prior generations as the sound of fingernails scratched across a slate chalkboard. Just reading those words, your hackles may have risen. You don't even have to hear the sound. You just have to have me describe it to you, and your hackles rise. Why our hackles rise with that sound above and beyond all other sounds in human experience, we do not know. But clearly, the rising of the hackles is only one element of otobiological emergency response, in company with a massive internal release of catecholamines by adrenal medullary cells that increase heart rate and mobilize glucose production. And we can't help it. Maybe the sound is directly reminiscent of noises made by the most vicious of antediluvian predators, screeching down canyon walls or crawling across scumbles of slate. Maybe it is akin to the most intimidating attack noises of creatures long extinct, but not yet forgotten. Our body memory so strong that our only options are fight or flight. But now, surely, the gride makes for an innate yet false alarm, in that most of us have nothing to fear from fingernails scratched on slate, unless for bad penmanship. So we enter this fraught world ready to be alarmed, and falsely alarmed. Whether the false alarms arise from paranoia, loneliness, spite, self-importance, or hyperacuity, which may explain how quickly we shrug off many of the sounds we are taught to hear as alarms once we feel ourselves secure, or on the other side of the tympanum, when we are kept for too long on tenterhooks in a risk society with its perpetually edgy states of code yellow, code orange, code red, and, as we saw with Michael's talk before, all of the proliferations of risk. If the very presence from birth of the startle reflex now serves as an indicator of neurophysiological normality, so also a few months later after birth does our ability to sense things coming. I am not speaking of ESP or anything oracular. I am speaking of the physiological experience of feeling oneself on a collision course, which entails a complex neuromuscular calculus of motion and asymptotes. In 2009, 2 Dutch researchers published a path-breaking research on how and when infants acquire the skill of seeing it coming. They posed an elementary question about humans that had previously been posed narrowly and primarily visually with regard to locusts and pigeons. How does the infant brain sense looming danger? They found that 5 to 11-month-old infants, as they mature, became adept at taking not only time into account, but their own increasing mobility as they assessed the situational jeopardy of an object rapidly occupying a larger and larger percentage of their visual space. Specifically, the 2 researchers, van der Velde and van der Meer, tracked by means of high-density electroencephalography the neural expansion of an infant's theta wave activity, which, quote, is strongly related to cognitive and anticipatory attentional processes. To be able to show, as they did, that a 10-month-old infant knows immediate looming danger when it sees it. I take this line of research to emphasize that our survival skills as soft-shelled beings are neurophysiologically keyed to deal swiftly with surprise, to maneuver deftly with respect to the sudden appearance of anything unaccustomed, baffling, or all too well known but catastrophic. What happens then when we so shape, monitor, and electrify our environments that they keep sending us insistent messages that make emergency feel routine and suddenness virtually quotidian? In the midst of the last fin de siècle in 1996, a team of zoologists and psychologists led by John C. Wingfield at the University of Washington postulated a hitherto undiscovered life stage among birds and putatively other beings, a stage keyed, and I love this term, to the constant presence of LPFs, labile perturbation factors. Labile meaning short-lived. They termed this new stage of life the emergency life history stage, which, like other stages, has a unique homeostatic regulatory system with distinct behavioral and physiological changes that enhance a bird's prospect for survival. In brief, to be technical and then not, they found considerable evidence that glucocorticosteroids and other hormones in the in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cascade initiate and orchestrate the emergency life history stage within minutes to hours, and that a number of associated substages helped birds, particularly birds captured from the wild and installed in experimenters' cages, to avoid potential deleterious effects of stress that may result from chronically elevated levels of circulating glucocorticosteroids. Let me rephrase that. Bodies exposed to chronic threats and or chronic warnings of threat do much more than mount guard. They reconstitute themselves through the wonders of biochemistry. They become other in much the same fashion that adolescents are other than children, or elders other than adolescents. So, how does risk fit into this biochemical scheme of things? Risk, as you have heard, is a cogitation. Indeed, you or many tribes of artists might want to argue that risk is what makes the cogito ergo sum add up, given that Descartes himself arrived at his defiantly thoughtful existence while trying to escape the depredations of the 30 Years' War, and after he had dreamed a particularly disturbing set of dreams in which he always seemed to be out of place and in more than one sense out of time. So the cogito ergo sum of modern philosophy is really just biochemical. Indeed, several artists interviewed in the video trailer for this exhibition itself claimed that without risk, their art, and perhaps even their lives, would be flat, unavailing. Indeed, it seems that risk is what brings the artist into her art, what makes the relationship between an artist and his audience personal enough to justify its and to question our being. As much as an artist takes creative risks with materials, with political positions, with career and economic stability, art at its most energetic and quote-unquote alive does more than express a personal putting in jeopardy. Like the works today in the Turner, especially relevant, of course, given my introduction, The Birth Chamber of Heather Phillipson, it invokes the startle reflex, or at least presses us towards some reconstitution of our lives in the presence of LPFs. But if art, even the riskiest art, were merely emergency alarm, it would turn out often, as in every epoch and every life, to be false alarm. as most of the alarms in our lives are. So consider art rather in terms of our ordinary innate ability to sense what is on a collision course with us, our ability to calculate distances between ourselves and an always impinging world. And think of art, therefore, working like a proximity fuse, of which there is now more than one example in this exhibition on risk. Think of art drawing us close enough, like the paintings of Joseph Mallord William Turner himself, so that it can explode in our face. Explode our assumptions, explode our world, and challenge the distance so carefully set up by Descartes between percept and precept. Risk, however, is a terribly compromised term. Risk management, for example, is a phrase so widely used now for corporations facing simple loss of face, for politicians covering a cover-up, and investment brokers over-invested in bad securities, as it is for statisticians and annuaries banking on probabilities of morbidity and mortality and stupidity. Even in the art world, risk is a bankable asset, a puffery that assures collectors and connoisseurs alike that an oeuvre is on the cutting edge, which really hasn't changed its meaning, that phrase, cutting edge, despite Yoko Ono's cut piece of the 1960s. How could you be on the avant-garde and not be taking a risk? Aren't the two part of a pari-mutual bet? So, we need to be careful about exalting risk in art, or exalting and exulting in risk itself, lest we make adventure into another gambit for venture capital and more investment in the work of Damien Hirst. The X Games have become sports. Foolishly dangerous pranks have become reality television. And atrocities themselves are, for film, documentary, or feature, anti-capitalist or post-apocalyptic, grist for profit. What does it mean to live in a world where cliffhangers are no less common in comedies than in melodrama and thriller? Where popular psychologists press risk on people whose creative or amorous lives are blocked. Where risk seems to be both the condition and the cure. So we need to be zealously cautious about embracing risk as the central fact either of art or of life in a postmodern or post-industrial or global or whatever we think we are world. Because the laying off of risk on individual citizens and on artists is a concerted strategy by which neoliberal forces lay off any corporate responsibility for the worst consequences of avarice or indiscriminate use of our resources. Artists on the avant-garde should not be advance agents for any system of purely individual liability. So here I am, raising an alarm. Risk is a compound of time, scrutiny, and habits of apprehension. As an historian myself of the apocalyptic movements of the past, of noise, of emergency, and myself as a lifelong asthmatic, my sense of time, my idea of scrutiny, and certainly my habits of apprehension are idiosyncratic. And they're idiosocratic, by which I mean that the questions I ask and the dialogues I entreat are open questions as much for myself as for any audience. And of course, as so many alarms are, I may be raising a false alarm. Between alarm as startle reflex and alarm as signal, between alarm as a technique for damping panic and alarm as panic-stricken noise, between false alarm as confusion and as an inevitable result of technical complexity, between false alarm as an anti-authoritarian protest and false alarm as a cunning tactic, it seems that we have all entered a world where alarm may be heard, seen, felt, incorporated, and internalized as a steady state, like that emergency life history stage. Such a steady state, as Michael was beginning to point out, has long-term unwelcome consequences. Hormonal disruption, digestive disorders, circulatory stress, postural instability, emotional aggravation, mental distraction, not to speak of larger collective downturns, heuristic, deliberative, cultural, political, and moral. Most terrifying now, aesthetically, acoustically, psychologically, is that for which we have no canon of mutually comprehensible alarms, no disambiguated semiotics of warning. The slow violence that Rob Nixon talks about, phenomena too global, too secret, or perfusive, too poorly understood or complacently misunderstood, too easily ignored or too cumulative to register in the singular moment. We have no potent alarms, for example, of millions of landmines and the spent shell casings of uranium-tipped bullets, for the devastations of life as a more or less permanently displaced person. The average number of years that a so-called displaced person remains displaced has increased substantially since World War II. We have no potent alarms for multiple versions of homelessness in a world whose shores and coastal settlements are already under siege by the rising waters and the extreme waves of an inhumanly complex global warming. So, what is it we need to ask ourselves and the artists in our company? What is it now that every 10-month-old can see coming?